long before the earliest recorded epics, before the first stones of ancient empires were ever stacked upon one another, and long before the petty ambitions of mortals dared to reach toward the heavens, there was a profound and terrifying emptiness. To understand the catastrophic events that would eventually bring the Sword Coast to the brink of total annihilation, one must first understand the stage upon which these tragedies were set. The foundational architecture of the universe was established by Lord Ao, the overdeity of realm space, a silent and ultimate judge who wove the raw, chaotic energy of the phlogiston to create the universe that houses the world of Toril. Imagine, if you will, the phlogiston. It was not empty space as mortals conceive of it, but a vibrant, highly volatile, and chaotic ocean of radiant ether. It was a churning expanse of limitless potential, highly combustible, and entirely untamed. Lord Ao, an entity so vast and incomprehensible that mortal minds risk madness in merely contemplating his nature, stood above this swirling chaos. He did not speak. He did not boast of his power. As the ultimate judge, his will was absolute, enacted in a silence that deafened the cosmos. With unimaginable precision, Lord Ao reached his hands into the dangerous, iridescent fires of the phlogiston. He gathered the threads of raw creation and began to weave them. He separated the volatile energy from the pockets of reality, crafting the great, protective crystal spheres that would house the planetary systems, and within one of these grand, cosmic enclosures, he wove the universe that would eventually come to harbor the world of Toril. Yet even within this newly forged universe, there was no form as we would recognize it today. The theological consensus among Faerunian scholars posits that prior to the differentiation of light and darkness, there existed only a timeless, misty realm of shadows. This was not the menacing entropic darkness that mortals fear when the sun dips below the horizon. It was a pure, undisturbed nothingness. It was an endless ocean of twilight mist, devoid of heat, devoid of cold, devoid of the very concept of time itself. In this early cosmos, a single second and an eternity were entirely indistinguishable. There was no wind to stir the mist. There was no gravity to pull upon it. It was a state of perfect, absolute equilibrium, a silent breath held by the universe before the chaos of existence truly began. From this primordial nothingness coalesced two twin deities representing fundamental cosmic polarities: Selûne, the goddess of light and creation, and Shar, the goddess of darkness and oblivion. They did not arrive from elsewhere. Rather, they emerged from the mist itself, the first stirring of consciousness in a universe that had previously only known the silent judgment of Lord Ao. They were two halves of a singular whole, born at the exact same immeasurable moment. Selûne manifested as a radiant beacon, a being whose very essence hummed with kinetic energy, possibility, and the bright, searing power of creation. She was the silver spark in the void. Beside her, inextricably linked to her sister, was Shar. Shar was the deep, obsidian quiet. She was the embodiment of the void they had just awakened from, a goddess of dark and beautiful oblivion who cherished the serene stillness of the shadows. For an epoch unmeasured by any mortal clock, the twin sisters moved through the misty expanse together, their differing natures existing in a delicate, harmonious balance. They were the first family, the first relationship, and the first true powers to shape the empty canvas Lord Ao had provided. Working in unison, These entities were responsible for the creation of the heavenly bodies, ultimately granting life to Shantea, the very embodiment of the world of Toril. Together, Selune's light and Shar's darkness gathered the cosmic dust, pulling the formless matter into spheres of rock and ice. They sculpted the planets and set them spinning within the grand, empty spaces of their universe. Their crowning achievement was a singular, massive sphere of earth and primordial sea. As the sisters poured their divine essence into this world, the planet itself began to stir with a nascent, rudimentary consciousness. This was Chantea, the Great Mother, the planetary spirit who was the physical and spiritual embodiment of Toril. At this stage, Chantea was merely a barren, rocky orb, covered in cold oceans and shrouded in the eternal twilight of her creators. She had form, she had mass, and she had life, but it was a dormant, frozen life. As Chantea's consciousness expanded, she became aware of her own vast, desolate surface. She felt the incredible, crushing cold of the shadow realm pressing down upon her rocky crust. She could sense the deep, buried potential within her own soil, the seeds of flora, the beginnings of fauna, the raw materials required for a vibrant, thriving biosphere. But it was all trapped beneath a layer of perpetual frost. The Great Mother was alive, but she was shivering in the dark, driven by an instinctual, desperate need to see her potential realized. A voice rose from the frozen planet. It was an irreconcilable, ideological schism that arose when Chantea begged for warmth to nurture life upon her planetary form. Her plea was not spoken in words, but in the groaning of tectonic plates, the shifting of frozen tides, and a deep, psychic resonance that echoed across the misty void, reaching the ears of the twin goddesses who had formed her. Chantea asked merely for a gentle heat, a sustained warmth that would allow the ice to melt, the oceans to flow freely, and the dormant seeds within her crust to finally breach the surface and bloom. This single humble request from a planetary spirit would become the catalyst for the greatest metaphysical tragedy in the history of the cosmos. The sisters, who had existed in perfect, silent harmony since their coalescent birth from the primordial mist, suddenly found themselves fundamentally divided on how to answer the Great Mother's plea. The delicate balance they had maintained shattered against the rigid edges of their intrinsic natures. Selûne looked upon the shivering world of Chantea and felt a profound, overwhelming surge of maternal empathy. The goddess of light and creation sought to provide this warmth, seeking to foster growth and vitality across the planet. Selûne saw the beauty in the struggle of life. She envisioned lush green forests reaching toward a bright sky, oceans teeming with swimming creatures, and eventually the rise of mortal beings capable of love, art, and worship. She understood that life required energy, movement, and heat, and she was entirely willing to sacrifice the quiet peace of the universe to see Chantea's surface burst into a brilliant tapestry of living color. Shar, however, reacted with absolute fundamental horror. The goddess of darkness and oblivion desired to maintain the cold, silent embrace of the void. To Shar, the universe was already perfect in its quiet, misty state. The existence of life, with all its inherent noise, its messy biological functions, its suffering, its chaotic movements, and its inevitable decay, was an insult to the pristine, eternal beauty of the shadows. Shar viewed Chantea's plea not as a request for nurturing, but as a vile corruption of the pristine stillness they had enjoyed since the beginning of existence. She believed that providing warmth would unleash an uncontrollable contagion of existence that would permanently ruin the peaceful quiet of oblivion. The sisters stood at a cosmic impasse. Selune's silver light flared with protective determination, her divine will focused entirely on answering the planetary spirit's cry. Shar's darkness deepened, solidifying into an impenetrable wall of freezing shadow, her resolve hardened by a desperate desire to protect the endless twilight from the noisy, chaotic infection of life. The endless mist that had once united them now swirled violently between them, pulled by the opposing gravitational forces of their divine fury. The peaceful era of the misty shadows was over. The universe, still in its absolute infancy, was about to experience the terrifying, destructive reality of a family torn apart by an argument that could only be settled with the violent unmaking of the cosmos. The silence of the primordial era shattered with a soundless metaphysical scream. The ensuing conflict, known to historical scholars as the War of Light and Darkness, fractured the early cosmos. This was not a war of clashing steel or marching armies, but a cataclysm of opposing fundamental realities fighting for supremacy over the empty void. Where Selune cast brilliant, searing beams of stellar luminescence to warm the trembling rock of the planetary spirit, Shantea, Shar conjured crushing tides of absolute, suffocating void to extinguish them. The endless misty twilight that had once enveloped creation was torn apart, violently separated into blinding day and pitch-black night. The cosmos wept as the twin goddesses hurled the newly formed celestial bodies at one another, cracking the newborn firmament with the sheer, unadulterated force of their ideological hatred. Gravity twisted and buckled under their wrath, and the delicate equilibrium of the newly woven universe began to fray at its cosmic edges. As the eons-long celestial struggle raged on without a clear victor, the world of Toril grew dangerously unstable, caught in the terrifying crossfire of absolute zero and blinding radiation. Recognizing that her sister's entropic will was unyielding and that the Great Mother would soon freeze into a lifeless husk forever if drastic measures were not taken, Selune committed an act of staggering, desperate power. During this primordial war, the goddess of light reached her luminous hands across the planar boundaries and plunged them deep into the roaring, chaotic heart of the elemental plane of fire. The heat was unimaginable, a screaming inferno of pure, unfiltered destruction. Yet Selune endured the burning agony. With a terrifying exertion of divine will, she tore a massive, roiling sphere of eternal flame from its native realm and dragged it into the physical universe, bringing forth a sun that ignited the world in a wash of glorious, life-giving heat. This monumental act of creation did more than just warm the shivering planetary crust. The sheer concentration of radiant energy from this new sun spontaneously achieved sentience, giving birth to Amunater, the ancient sun god. The sudden, overwhelming brilliance of the sun and the rise of its golden deity was a definitive, magnificent victory for the preservation of life. It bathed Toril in a golden glow, melting the primordial ice and allowing the first oceans to flow freely. However, it was also an act that sparked the eternal, unforgiving fury of Shar. The goddess of oblivion shrieked as her beloved pristine darkness was permanently scarred by the dawn, her hatred crystallizing into a cold, venomous resolve that would infect the cosmos for millennia to come. Driven mad by the radiant desecration of her silent void, Shar lunged at her sister with an unprecedented world-ending malice. The violent, cosmic clash between the sisters reached a devastating, blinding crescendo. Their divine essences, the fundamental fabrics of light and shadow, collided and sheared against one another with such apocalyptic force that raw, bleeding pieces of their very beings were ripped away. From this chaotic intermingling of torn light and fractured dark, surrounded by the screaming echoes of their war, a new, magnificent entity coalesced. This violent collision resulted in the creation of Mistral, the original goddess of magic. Mistral was not a being of extreme light or absolute dark, but a vibrant, pulsing manifestation of raw, arcane potential. She was the kinetic energy of the universe given form, humming with a terrifying and beautiful power. To stabilize her own volatile existence and bring a semblance of order to the dangerous residual energies unleashed by her mother's war, Mistral expanded her essence across the entire universe. This expansion led to the formation of the weave itself. The weave draped over the cosmos like an invisible, vibrating tapestry of silver threads, establishing the fundamental, underlying framework for all arcane manipulation. It was a magnificent, delicate mechanism of mystical geometry that permeated every stone, every drop of water, and every breath of air, a stabilizing net that would eventually allow mortals to touch the power of the divine without immediately turning to ash. Despite the stabilizing presence of the weave and the warmth of the new sun, the hatred between light and dark had irrevocably poisoned the heavens, plunging the growing divine pantheon into an era of celestial violence that culminated in the dawn cataclysm. This was a period of devastating, unfathomable divine warfare, where the petty grievances and grand ideological differences of the gods spilled over into total, unrelenting slaughter. While the exact chronology of the early cosmos is notoriously difficult to measure before the standardization of mortal calendars, scholars have approximately dated the zenith of this devastating divine warfare to the ancient era of the years 760 to 63 Dala reckoning in some chronicles, though its bitter roots trace back to the very dawn of time. During this era, the heavens bled a terrible golden ichor. The divine realm became a theater of tragedy, a terrifying testament to the destructive potential of immortal beings whose emotions burned far hotter than any mortal heart. During this cataclysm, deities were slain and corrupted in horrific ways that forever scarred the metaphysical landscape. The goddess of the raging oceans, Umberlee, driven by a chaotic, unfathomable malice, murdered Myrddin, the serene and beloved wife of the Watcher god Helm. This senseless act of violence echoed through the pantheon, leaving a legacy of bitter, unending sorrow and proving that even the divine were not immune to the darkest impulses of murder. Even more tragic, perhaps, was the terrible fate of Tyche, the bright and joyful goddess of fortune. The creeping, putrid god of rot, Moander, ambushed and corrupted Tyche with an inescapable, rotting affliction that ate away at her golden essence. As the sickening necrotic disease spread through Tyche's divine form, it threatened to infect the entirety of the pantheon with an unstoppable, agonizing decay. Selûne was faced with a horrifying, impossible choice to save the heavens. Weeping tears of stellar light the goddess of creation, was forced to strike her beloved friend down with a devastating beam of pure, purifying energy. The sheer, overwhelming force of Seluna's agonizing blow, combined with the vile corruption of Moander's rot, resulted in Taichi splitting apart violently into two entirely new, opposing goddesses. From the shattered, weeping remains of fortune rose Timera, the bright maiden of good luck, and Bishaba, the cruel, spiteful maiden of misfortune. The universe had grown infinitely more complicated and infinitely more cruel. The cosmos was unraveling at the seams. The fabric of reality groaned under the immense metaphysical weight of murdered gods and warring pantheons. The cosmic instability reached its terrifying zenith in a catastrophic event known to historians as the Tearfall. The skies bruised purple, and the stars themselves seemed to shake loose from their moorings in the heavens. It was a catastrophic event where Lord Ao, the silent, ultimate overdeity who had originally woven the universe from the chaotic phlogiston, finally broke his long, observational silence and intervened directly. Lord Ao recognized that the endless warring factions of the divine and the ancient, elemental primordials could no longer coexist upon the same sphere without destroying it completely. With a gesture that defied mortal comprehension, a movement that rippled through the very bedrock of existence, Lord Ao reached down and grasped the planetary mass of the Great Mother. In a display of ultimate, terrifying authority, he sundered the original world of Abir Toril into two completely separate, parallel realities. The sheer scale of this separation is difficult to articulate. Entire continents were shifted across dimensional boundaries. Oceans were halved in a heartbeat, and the skies themselves were duplicated and split. The twin worlds were separated by an impenetrable metaphysical veil, a boundary of absolute cosmic law. The world of Abir was given to the primordials to rule over, and the world of Toril was granted exclusively to the gods, enforcing a mandatory cosmological balance. Yet the silent judge knew that simply separating the combatants across dimensions would not prevent the gods from eventually destroying Toril from within through their endless bickering and unquenchable ambition. To ensure this fragile equilibrium of law and chaos was permanently maintained, Lord Ao forged the absolute indestructible artifacts known as the Tablets of Fate. These were not mere stones, but luminous, cosmic mandates that pulsed with the unyielding authority of the overdeity. Upon these grand tablets, Lord Ao permanently dictated the precise roles, the absolute responsibilities, and the specific portfolios of the entire divine pantheon. By etching their duties into the indestructible surface of the Tablets of Fate, Lord Ao bound the gods to a strict, inescapable framework. They were no longer free to simply war for supremacy or abandon their posts. They were legally and metaphysically required to answer the prayers of mortals, to tend to their specific domains, and to maintain the delicate balance of the world they had so nearly ripped apart. The creation of the weave and the subsequent establishment of these divine portfolios set the stage for a new, dangerous era, an era where mortal ambition would soon intersect with divine authority, laying the terrible groundwork for future tragedies. The establishment of the divine portfolios by Lord Ao brought a necessary, rigid structure to the chaotic heavens, permanently binding the gods to their respective duties to prevent another reality-shattering catastrophe. Yet some domains were so incredibly vast, so utterly absolute in their metaphysical weight, that they defied the very concept of divine balance. Long before the complicated bureaucracy of the afterlife as it is understood today, and long before the ascension of the modern, fractured pantheon of the grave. The cosmic architecture of mortality was chillingly simple. Before the ascension of the modern gods of death, the entirety of the portfolio encompassing strife, death, and the dead was held by a single, unimaginably powerful entity, Jergal, the Lord of the end of everything. To speak his name in those ancient, forgotten days was to invite the freezing chill of the grave into one's own marrow. He was not a god of cruel, passionate murder or spiteful burning plagues. He was the cold, mathematical certainty of the end. He was the great, unyielding ledger where every final breath was recorded, the final arbiter of all things that possessed a beginning. To truly grasp the horrifying scale of Jergal's existence, one must journey mentally beyond the vibrant, noisy colors of the material plane and descend deep into the suffocating despair of the gray waste. This was a realm where color and hope went to die, a bleak, sprawling expanse of unending ash, withered trees, and featureless, weeping skies. It was a place entirely devoid of wind, devoid of natural sound, save for the dry, scraping echo of billions of souls shuffling toward their final, inevitable judgment. Here, amidst the pale dunes of crushed bone and forgotten shattered dreams, Jergal ruled unopposed from the bone throne within the gray waste, overseeing the inevitable end of all mortal and immortal life. The bone throne was a towering, grotesque monument to finality, constructed not from the fragile remains of mere mortals, but from the massive calcified skulls of forgotten primordials and ancient celestial worms who had once dared to think themselves eternal. From this dreadful, silent seat, wrapped in decaying silken robes and an aura of absolute stillness, the skeletal lord of the end of everything watched the universe slowly grind toward its inevitable conclusion. For countless, unrecorded millennia, Jergal performed his grim duties with an unfeeling, robotic efficiency. He sorted the arriving souls, he tallied the dead, and he watched the grand, vibrant tapestry of existence slowly fray at the edges, knowing that eventually every thread would find its way to his hands. However, the absolute nature of his dominion bred profound cosmic apathy. When one holds the undisputed power to snuff out the stars, and when absolutely no entity in the vast woven cosmos dares to challenge your authority, the passage of time becomes a meaningless, infinitely heavy burden. Jergal found himself paralyzed by the sheer, unending monotony of his own absolute supremacy. He felt no malice toward the living who still drew breath, nor did he feel any pity or sorrow for the dead who crawled to his feet. He felt only an exhaustion so deep that it permeated the very essence of his skeletal form. He sat upon his throne of ancient bone, his hollow eye sockets staring out across the colorless expanse of the gray waste, and he realized a terrible philosophical truth. Without challenge, Jergal reasoned, there is only gloom and nothingness. Existence, even for a god of ultimate terrifying power, required friction to possess meaning. Without an adversary, without the thrill of opposition, his absolute rule was nothing more than an eternal, suffocating prison of his own meticulous making. As the Lord of the end of everything sank deeper into his divine, paralyzing depression, a tempest of unprecedented, terrifying mortal ambition was brewing upon the distant, vibrant world of Toril. In a universe governed by the strict, unyielding laws of the tablets of fate, mortal beings were expected to live brief, brilliant lives, to worship their assigned deities, and ultimately to die and submit quietly to Jergal's ledger. Simultaneously, a trio of immensely powerful, evil mortal adventurers sought to claim ultimate divine power. They were not content to be mere footnotes in the sprawling annals of history. They desired to tear the pen from the cosmic author's hand and write their own eternal dominion over the heavens and the earth. These were men of unparalleled cruelty and staggering arcane and martial prowess, individuals whose very names caused kings to tremble and entire nations to despair. These individuals were Bane the Tyrant, Baal the Assassin, formerly known as Tharlagont Baal, and Mirkul the Necromancer, historically recorded as Mirkul Bey al-Kursi. Each of them was a terrifying force of nature in their own right, drawn together by a mutual, sociopathic hunger for supremacy. Bane was a warlord of unmatched tactical brilliance and iron will, a man who believed that the entire world was inherently chaotic and was meant to kneel in perfect obedience beneath his booted heel. Baal was a shadow-given form, a master of silent slaughter who found a sickening, intoxicating beauty in the intimate act of extinguishing a beating heart. Mirkul was a genius of the dark arts, a man who viewed the barrier between life and death not as an absolute cosmic law, but as a minor fleshy inconvenience to be dismantled through the foulest necromantic studies. Born centuries before the fall of the Netherese Empire, these mortals engaged in an epic campaign of conquest, commanding vast armies and demonstrating their might by successfully tracking and destroying a primordial entity. Let the sheer impossible magnitude of that achievement linger in your mind. Primordials were ancient, elemental forces of raw chaos, beings that predated the gods themselves, entities that the silent Judge Lord Ao had specifically segregated to a parallel reality because their mere presence threatened the foundational stability of the world. Yet through a combination of ruthless military strategy, unfathomable arcane power, and a collective monstrous willpower, Bane, Baal, and Mirkul managed to hunt one of these elemental titans down and extinguish its chaotic spark. This monumental, reality-defying victory cemented their belief that they were no longer bound by the fragile, weeping limitations of mortal existence. They believed they were already gods, merely waiting to claim their rightful thrones. However, claiming true godhood required more than simply slaughtering a powerful beast. It required a recognized portfolio, and the portfolio they desired above all others belonged to the undisputed master of the grave. Their lifelong bloody quest led them through the outer planes, charting a terrifying path of destruction across realms where mortals were never meant to tread. They descended into the lower planes, their boots eventually sinking into the colorless ash of the gray waste. The air grew thick with the wailing of the damned and the freezing cold of eternal entropy, but the trio marched onward, driven by an insatiable, consuming hunger for supreme authority that warmed their blood against the chill of the underworld. Jergal, watching from his distant throne, did not make their approach easy. The Bone Throne was guarded by the accumulated, horrific defenses of millions of years of death. As they traversed the bleak, ashen dunes, they battled armies of skeletons, mindless, clattering waves of bone that sought to drag the arrogant intruders down into the dust. When the skeletons shattered under Bane's tyrannical mace, they faced legions of zombies, shambling horrors of rotting flesh that poisoned the very ground they walked upon. As they pushed deeper into the suffocating waste, the physical gave way to the spectral. They were swarmed by hordes of non-corporeal wraiths, screaming icy spirits that sought to freeze the lifeblood in their veins and tear their mortal souls directly from their bodies. Bahal danced through the spectral storm, his blades infused with such dark, murderous intent that they could sever the very ties of ethereal existence. Finally, as the towering skeletal spires of Jergal's inner sanctum loomed through the oppressive gray fog, they faced the ultimate guardians. It was a punishing gauntlet of leeches, ancient undead spellcasters of terrifying intellect and magical supremacy, tasked with ensuring that no mortal ever disturbed the Lord of the Dead. The arcane crossfire was blinding, a maelstrom of necrotic energy and destructive evocation that would have vaporized entire mortal armies in a single heartbeat. Yet Mirkul, with his unparalleled mastery over the necromantic arts, systematically unraveled their complex spells and turned their own dark magic against them, shattering their phylacteries and silencing their ancient incantations forever. Bloody, utterly exhausted, yet burning with an unholy, triumphant fire, the three mortal conquerors finally breached Jergal's sanctum. They stood before the heavy, ancient doors of the Bone Throne, their weapons drawn, entirely prepared to wage an apocalyptic war against the god of death himself. They believed they were stepping into the most brutal, cataclysmic battle of their existence, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into a masterclass of divine manipulation. The heavy, ancient doors of the inner sanctum groaned as they were forced open by the three mortal conquerors. The air within the throne room was stale, tasting of ancient dust and the metallic tang of forgotten blood. The trio stood upon the threshold, breathing heavily from their slaughter of the Lich Guardians outside, their weapons still humming with residual, destructive magic. At the far end of the cavernous hall sat the Bone Throne, a towering, jagged monument of calcified primordial remains. Upon it rested Jergal, the lord of the end of everything, cloaked in decaying silk and absolute silence. Expecting a cataclysmic battle for supremacy, the trio immediately threatened the Lord of the Dead. They spread out across the cold stone floor, forming a tactical crescent, their mortal arrogance blinding them to the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the divine entity they sought to depose. Bane, clad in heavy, dark armor that seemed to absorb the meager light of the hall, took a thunderous step forward and slammed his mace against the ground. Bane claimed the throne of evil, his voice echoing with the absolute certainty of a warlord who had never known defeat. Beside him, Baal, a silhouette of twitching muscle and venomous intent, brandished blades that dripped with the dark essence of their slain enemies. Baal threatened to destroy Jergal before he could raise a finger, promising a death so swift and brutal that the ancient god would not even have time to register his own unmaking. On the opposite flank stood Mirkul, his skeletal features twisted into a mask of supreme, arcane arrogance. Radiating a sickening aura of necrosis, Mirkul promised to imprison his essence for eternity, vowing to trap the Lord of the Dead in an inescapable phylactery of his own foul design. The mortal conquerors braced themselves, their muscles tense, waiting for the devastating wave of divine wrath that would surely follow such colossal insults. However, the catastrophic explosion of necrotic fury never came. The oppressive silence of the room held for a long, agonizing moment. Then the ancient god moved. Instead of engaging in combat, Jergal arose with a weary expression, freely offering his throne and promising to serve as their seneschal until they grew comfortable with their new powers. The trio stood frozen in profound disbelief. The ultimate arbiter of existence, the being whose very gaze could extinguish stars, simply sighed, stepped down from the dais of bone, and gestured vaguely toward the empty seat of absolute power. He looked upon the three terrifying warlords not as threats, but as a long-awaited salvation from his eternal, suffocating boredom. The historical data suggests that Jergal's abdication was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and divine foresight. He knew that opposing them would require effort, a concept he had long grown entirely exhausted by. More importantly, he understood the fundamentally flawed nature of mortal ambition. By stepping down and asking the simple question, "Who among you shall rule?" he instantly dissolved their fragile alliance, causing the stunned trio to fall into endless infighting while he looked on with indifference. The question hung in the stagnant air like a venomous cloud. In a fraction of a second, the brotherhood forged in the fires of primordial combat evaporated. Bane turned a suspicious, hateful glare toward Mirkul. Paul shifted his blades, adjusting his grip to strike the very men he had fought beside just moments before. The grand conquerors were reduced to squabbling scavengers, fighting over a carcass. Weapons clashed in the shadows of the empty throne. Sparks flew as Bane's tyrannical might met Baal's lethal speed and Mirkul's rotting magic. The battle threatened to tear the throne room apart, but it was a disorganized, petty skirmish, born of profound greed. Recognizing that their battle would result in the mutual exhaustion or an eternity of pointless conflict, Jergal intervened, proposing a game of skill to divide his immense portfolio. His hollow voice cut through the chaos, a chillingly calm breeze against the raging inferno of their vanity. He suggested a wager, a contest to determine who was truly worthy of the ultimate prize. To settle the matter, he provided the skulls of his three most powerful leashes for a contest of skull bowling across the gray waste, decreeing that whoever bowled the farthest would claim the ultimate prize. The absurdity of the situation was entirely lost on the arrogant trio. They marched back out into the freezing, colorless expanse of the outer plains, each clutching the polished ancient skull of a defeated sorcerer. They drew a line in the ash, preparing to hurl the macabre spheres across the endless dunes. This contest, however, was interrupted by Malar the Beast Lord, who arrived to visit Jergal, realized the stakes, and chased after the skulls to halt the contest so he could participate. Malar, a terrifying, savage god of the hunt, bounded across the gray dunes with terrifying speed, his claws tearing through the ash as he batted the bouncing skulls away, howling his demand to be included in the division of the supreme power. The mortal trio bristled with outrage, unwilling to share even a fraction of their newly won dominion with a feral, chaotic beast. To prevent sharing power with the beast, Jergal proposed an alternative game of chance, knucklebones. It was a game that required no vast arenas, no bouncing skulls for a beast to intercept, only the quiet, tense casting of lots in the shadows. To provide the playing pieces, the ancient god performed a deeply unsettling act. He literally broke off his own skeletal fingers for the trio to cast. The sharp, dry crack of the bone snapping echoed loudly in the silent waste. He handed the smooth, calcified joints to the mortals, offering them the very fabric of his being to gamble with. The three warlords knelt in the ash of the gray waste, the freezing mist swirling around them as they cast the broken fingers of the god of death. The clatter of the bones against the dry earth was a sound that would echo through the cosmos for thousands of years. The results of this divine wager fundamentally restructured the Faerunian pantheon, establishing the entities that would later orchestrate the absolute crisis. The immense, unified portfolio of the end of everything was violently fractured into three distinct, specialized domains of misery. The tyrant threw first, and fortune favored his heavy hand. Bane chose absolute rulership, seeking to command all mortal life and subjugate the weak, declaring himself the ultimate tyrant. He stood tall, his armor now radiating a dark, divine authority, demanding that all existence bend to his unyielding, cruel will. He believed he had won the grandest prize, securing dominion over the living world and ensuring that the nations of Toril would forever tremble at his name. The necromancer was second to choose from the remaining fragments of power. Mirkul's skeletal face stretched into a horrifying, smug grin. Mirkul chose dominion over the dead, reasoning that because all things, even gods, eventually die, Bane's subjects would inevitably fall into his domain. He believed himself infinitely wiser than the tyrant. Let Bane rule the fleeting, chaotic span of mortal life. Mirkul would rule the eternal, inescapable eternity of the grave. He draped himself in the shadows of the Bone Throne, reveling in the quiet despair of the afterlife. Finally, the assassin was left with the final, bloody remnant of Jergal's former glory. Bahal chose the act of death itself, declaring that both Bane and Mirkul must pay him honor, as he could starve Mirkul's kingdom or destroy Bane's through the act of murder. Bahal became the sudden strike in the dark, the violent end to a heartbeat, the terrifying transition between the tyrant's rule and the necromancer's domain. He viewed his siblings not as equals, but as cosmic parasites dependent entirely upon the bloody harvest he provided. As the three newly ascended gods preened in their corrupted glory, blind to their own limitations, the former lord of the end of everything retreated quietly into the shadows. Jergal merely smiled as the portfolios were divided, having successfully unburdened himself while ensuring the new god's ambitions would keep them perpetually at odds. He had traded the agonizing weight of absolute supremacy for the quiet, peaceful role of a mere scribe of the dead, watching with cold amusement as the three fools bound themselves to their own narrow, self-destructive obsessions. The tragic, violent tapestry of the cosmos had been permanently altered by a simple roll of the bones. Yet of the three victors, it was the assassin whose short-sighted arrogance would invite the most spectacular catastrophe. The historical irony of Paul's choice cannot be overstated. In his desperation to hold power over his peers, he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his own divine domain. By claiming the portfolio of murder, Paul tethered his divine essence to the act of violent death, an act that would ultimately necessitate his own demise and spark the devastating Paul-spawn crisis centuries later. He had built a godhood upon a foundation of absolute slaughter, entirely blind to the reality that the blade he had forged would eventually turn inward, tearing his own divine essence apart. The cosmic consequences of that ancient roll of the bones and the dark seeds planted by the Lord of Murder would not fully bloom until an era of unprecedented divine vulnerability millennia later. To truly understand the horrors that would eventually unfold within the city of Baldur's Gate, one must examine the ambitions of the Dead Three as they culminated in the catastrophic epic known as the Time of Troubles in the year 1358, Dala Reckoning. It was an era of suffocating dread where Lord Ao, the silent overdeity of the cosmos, grew furious over the theft of the sacred tablets of fate and enacted a punishment of unparalleled severity. He cast the deities down from their heavenly domains, shattering their celestial immortality and forcing the gods to walk toil in vulnerable mortal avatars. The skies turned a bruised, sickly purple, magic became wildly unpredictable, and the very ground shook with the heavy, panicked footsteps of fallen deities who suddenly knew the terrifying, icy grip of mortal fear. Among these exiled gods was Baal, the Lord of Murder. Trapped in a fragile shell of flesh and bone, Baal felt the icy wind of his own absolute end approaching. Anticipating his acute vulnerability and his highly potential death during this chaotic period, Baal enacted a cold, calculating, and unimaginably cruel contingency plan. Before the final blow could be struck against him, he traversed the continent, conceiving a vast multitude of mortal progeny, the cursed children who would come to be known as the Paulspawn. He did not create these children out of love or a desire for a lasting legacy. Rather, he spent his fleeting time infusing them with scattered, dormant fragments of his own dark, divine essence. His overarching parasitic design was a masterpiece of biological and metaphysical manipulation. Baal understood that the essence of murder thrives only in the act of violent destruction. His terrifyingly pragmatic calculation dictated that the violent deaths of these children would act as a catalyst. As the Baalspawn lived, fought, and inevitably died by the sword or the spell, their mortal shells would shatter, releasing his scattered essence back into the ether, where it would pool and slowly coalesce, eventually fueling his inevitable resurrection. He essentially transformed his own offspring into living, breathing phylacteries, walking vessels of butchery whose only true cosmic purpose was to bleed out upon the earth to feed their dead father. The prophecy of blood was soon realized. Following Baal's brutal death at the hands of the mortal Cyric, a cunning assassin who subsequently usurped the Dead Three's portfolios and ascended to dark godhood himself, the scattered Paulspawn began to awaken to their terrifying heritage. The divine taint within their veins, previously dormant, began to hum with a sickening, venomous urgency. Across the Sword Coast, from the freezing peaks of the spine of the world to the humid jungles of the south, these children were drawn together by a supernatural compulsion to seek each other out and slaughter one another. They experienced horrific nightmares of rivers running red with blood and waking visions that urged them to drive daggers into the backs of their own siblings. This tragic era was marked by immense, continent-spanning bloodshed as powerful Baalspawn surrendered to the whispers of their corrupted bloodline. Towering figures of ambition and cruelty, such as the heavily armored juggernaut Saravok Anchev, plotted to foment massive, catastrophic wars across the region, seeking to generate enough slaughter to ascend as the new Lord of Murder. Saravok manipulated politicians, poisoned alliances, and orchestrated massacres from the shadows, his eyes burning with the golden, unnatural light of his father's legacy. Yet the cosmic scales demanded a reckoning. Saravok's grand, bloody crusade was ultimately defeated by another Paulspawn, a sibling raised in peaceful cloistered halls who came to be known as Gorion's ward. This triumphant sibling, canonically recognized in the sprawling historical texts of Faerun as Abdel Adrian, stood over Saravok's defeated form, feeling the heavy, intoxicating rush of his sibling's divine essence, attempting to merge with his own. Hadrian's journey was one of excruciating moral endurance, constantly fighting the monstrous urges bubbling within his own soul as he proceeded to eliminate the most powerful of his corrupted siblings. His path was paved with the ashes of demigods. He vanquished the seemingly invincible fire giant, Yagashura, whose invulnerability was tied to a stolen, beating heart. The tragic climax of this crusade forced Adrian to confront the grand orchestrator of Baal's resurrection, a manipulative priestess named Amelissan, who had cleverly disguised herself as a benevolent protector of the Baal spawn to gather them for the final slaughter. The culmination of this continent-spanning fratricide took place within a terrifying metaphysical realm known as the Throne of Blood, a desolate landscape of bone and crimson rivers. Upon defeating Amelissan at the summit of this horrifying realm, Abdel Adrian was bathed in the blinding, radiant light of a celestial being. He was offered a monumental, reality-defining choice by a solar. He could embrace the gathered power and ascend to godhood, claiming the empty throne of his father, or he could reject the divine taint entirely and remain a man. Exhausted by a lifetime of violence and haunted by the ghosts of his siblings, Adrian rejected divinity. He theoretically surrendered his dark, Baal-spawn essence to the heavens, choosing instead to live out his remaining days as a mortal, unburdened by the crushing weight of cosmic murder. For a time, it seemed that the nightmare had finally ended. Adrian returned to the bustling metropolis of Baldur's Gate, becoming a celebrated hero whose name was sung in taverns from the lower city to the upper city estates. Over the decades, his legend only grew. He became the stern but just marshal of the Flaming Fist, and eventually the beloved Grand Duke of the city, guiding its people with a steady, compassionate hand. He lived a full century of relative peace, his dark origins fading into mere myth. However, the resilience of divine essence proved absolute, revealing a tragic and devastating flaw in the solar's celestial promise. A god's will cannot simply be wished away by a mortal heart. No matter how pure, the essence of the Lord of Murder was merely resting, biding its time in the shadows of a single, forgotten survivor. In the year 1482, Dalareckoning, grimly recorded in the annals of the Sword Coast as the year of the Narthex murders, the hard-won peace of Baldur's Gate was violently shattered. The tragedy unfolded during the Returning Day Festival in the lower city, a time of joyous celebration, colorful banners, and boisterous parades. Hidden amongst the cheering crowds was Viekang, a cowardly, deeply traumatized Paulspawn who had spent the last century running from shadows. Viekang was previously believed to have been miraculously cured of his erratic, fear-induced teleportation abilities by Amelissan in the besieged city of Saradush, but the darkness had simply gone dormant. Driven mad by the sudden, overwhelming resurgence of the taint in his blood, Viekang emerged from hiding and ambushed the centenarian Grand Duke Adrian in the middle of the crowded festival. The citizens watched in absolute horror as the beloved elderly duke was forced to draw steel one last time to defend his life against his own long-lost brother. The ensuing duel was chaotic, brutal, and tragically swift, concluding with an outcome that doomed the city to an age of suffering. The clash resulted in the death of one sibling and the immediate, terrifying absorption of the other's essence. The moment the final spark of Baal's essence coalesced into a single living vessel, the ancient curse overrode mortal flesh. The victor underwent a violent, agonizing transformation, bones snapping and reshaping, flesh tearing to reveal jagged spikes, culminating in the manifestation of the monstrous, towering nightmare known as the Bhaalspawn Slayer. The creature roared, its voice a symphony of 1,000 screaming murder victims, and turned its claws upon the panicked citizens of Baldur's Gate. The city's defenders rallied with desperate courage. The Flaming Fist, led by the steadfast Blaze Older Ravenguard and the fierce warrior Jezebel Leonin, ultimately slew the creature after a brutal struggle, leaving its broken, mutated corpse bleeding out upon the cobblestones. But the physical victory was a hollow, meaningless gesture, for the metaphysical damage was entirely irreversible. The death of the final Bhaalspawn did not end the curse. It fulfilled the ancient, parasitic prophecy enacted over a century prior. Deep in the cosmos, the scattered essence finally coalesced into a complete dark whole, and Baal was resurrected into the Faerunian pantheon as a quasi-divine entity. He tore his way back from the oblivion of the grave, reclaiming his portfolio of murder from Cyric, his eyes burning with an unquenchable thirst for slaughter. The heavens wept blood once more. This catastrophic event proves a terrifying cosmic reality. Mortal agency is frequently overridden by the intricate fail-safes of divine ambition. Abdel Adrian's century of heroism, his leadership, and his desperate rejection of evil was ultimately just a prolonged gestation period for the Lord of Murder's inevitable return. Baal had merely used a hero's life as a comfortable cocoon, proving that in the shadow of the gods, even the brightest light is often just kindling for a larger fire. While the gods plotted their petty, bloody resurrections in the heavens, and while mortal heroes and villains tore at each other for the scraps of divine power left behind in the dirt, a far older and infinitely more alien threat lay dormant in the cold, unfeeling reaches of the cosmos. The petty squabbles of the Faerunian pantheon, with their passionate hatreds and their desperate need for mortal worship, are entirely incomprehensible to a consciousness born outside the boundaries of normal reality. To understand the true peril that would eventually envelop the Sword Coast, one must shift their gaze away from the vibrant, weeping skies of the divine realms and look outward into the suffocating, silent darkness between the stars. Here, drifting in the lightless void, existed a terror that did not require faith to exert its dominance. These entities are known to the terrified scholars of Toril as the Mind Flayers, or Illithids, and they are the scattered, bitter remnants of a fallen ancient empire that once spanned the entirety of the multiverse. To look upon an Illithid is to gaze into a biological nightmare, a form that mocks the very concept of natural evolution. They are bipedal, yet their skin is entirely devoid of warmth or hair, resembling the cold, mauve, and sickly gray flesh of a deep-sea amphibian. Their heads are bulbous, ridged with pulsating veins that throb with unnatural intellectual weight. But the most horrifying aspect of their anatomy is their visage. Where a mouth and jaw should be, four slick, muscular tentacles writhe continuously, framing a circular, lamprey-like maw of concentric, razor-sharp teeth designed for one singular purpose: the extraction and consumption of living brain matter. Yet the physical horror of the mind flayer is merely a vessel for the true terror, their profound alien intellect. Millions of years ago, before the first human struck two stones together to make a spark, the Illithid Empire was a terrifying, omnipresent reality across countless planes of existence. They sailed the silver void of the astral plane in massive organic ships known as nautiloids, vessels equipped with spiraling shells and grasping tentacles that drifted silently through the cosmos, blotting out the stars. They did not conquer worlds to extract gold or minerals. They conquered to harvest consciousness. Entire planetary civilizations were subjugated in a matter of days, their populations herded into massive, lightless subterranean pens to serve as breeding stock and food for the tentacled overlords. However, no empire lasts forever, and the Illithid dominion was eventually shattered, their massive armadas broken, and their survivors forced to scatter into the deepest, darkest corners of the multiverse, hiding in the sunless depths of the Underdark. But the memory of their absolute supremacy did not fade. Instead, the collective trauma of their defeat calcified over the millennia, birthing a terrifying, overarching supremacist ideology known throughout their hidden colonies as the Grand Design. The Grand Design is not merely a political ambition or a desperate wish for vengeance. It is a fundamental biological imperative woven into the very fabric of their minds. Driven by this supremacist ideology, the Illithids relentlessly seek the complete and absolute resurgence of their lost empire. They view the current and chaotic state of the multiverse, where humans, elves, dwarves, and dragons freely walk the earth and build their own fragile kingdoms, as a disgusting temporary aberration of the natural cosmic order. The Grand Design dictates the total domination of all other life forms across the planes. In the cold, unblinking eyes of an Illithid, there is no concept of diplomacy, equality, or coexistence. They do not experience empathy or compassion, viewing all other sentient species merely as ignorant thralls meant to perform physical labor, or simply as walking sustenance meant to feed their ravenous psionic intellects. A human king and a lowly peasant are entirely equal to an Illithid. Both are merely vessels holding a brain that will eventually be consumed. The ultimate goal of the Grand Design is the establishment of a perfect, absolute psionic order across all of existence. To comprehend this, one must understand the nature of psionics. Unlike the magic of the gods, which relies on pulling threads from the external weave created by Mistral, psionics is an entirely internal manifestation of sheer, unadulterated mental supremacy. An Illithid does not utter incantations or wave a wand. They simply impose their terrifying will upon the physical world. They can crush a man's spine with a thought, levitate through the air by rejecting gravity, and communicate telepathically across vast distances through a network of mental static that feels like cold slime pressing against the inside of a mortal skull. The architects of this grand, terrifying order are the Elder Brains. Deep within the heart of every hidden Illithid colony lies a central, brine-filled pool. Suspended within this thick, preservative fluid is an immense pulsating mass of wrinkled brain tissue, an entity of staggering, almost godlike intellect. The elder brain is the physical and telepathic anchor of the colony. It does not merely lead the mind flayers, it is the colony. It houses the accumulated memories, knowledge, and personalities of thousands of deceased illithids, their consciousnesses absorbed into the central mass upon their death. The elder brain radiates a continuous, suffocating telepathic field, demanding total, unquestioning synchronization from every illithid within its radius. Under the hum of the elder brain, there is no individuality, no dissenting opinion, and no private thought. There is only the collective, freezing calculation of the hive mind, forever plotting the exact mathematical moment to strike and enslave the surface world. Because the elder brains demand absolute, flawless synchronization to execute the grand design, they are incredibly paranoid about any variable they cannot perfectly control. This paranoia manifests in a strict, unyielding legal and cultural code. A core tenet of illithid society is the absolute prohibition of any form of arcane magic. While magic and psionics may both alter reality, their philosophical foundations are violently opposed. Psionics represents order, the internal domination of the mind over matter. Magic, however, relies on the weave, an external, chaotic, and often unpredictable force that requires individual expression and creativity to manipulate. To the elder brain, the weave is a disgusting, volatile pollutant. It introduces a dangerous element of unpredictability into the colony's perfect equations. Therefore, the study or practice of arcane manipulation is considered deeply, fundamentally heretical by the hive mind. The illithids view magic as a disease, a corrupting influence that breeds individuality and threatens the absolute cohesion of their psionic network. Occasionally, when an illithid is born through the horrific, parasitic process of seromorphosis, where an illithid tadpole consumes the brain of a humanoid host and mutates their body, the resulting mind flayer might retain fractured, lingering memories of its former host's life. If that host was a powerful wizard or sorcerer, the newborn illithid might inexplicably find itself reaching for the weave rather than relying on its innate psionics. The punishment for this deviance is swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of mercy. Any spell-casting illithids who dare to pluck at the silver threads of the weave are immediately designated as existential threats to the colony. They are ruthlessly hunted down and executed by their own kind, ripped apart by the telepathic fury of the collective. The elder brains will not tolerate even a single spark of arcane energy within their hidden cities, for they demand absolute, pure reliance on psionics. To allow magic to flourish would be to admit a flaw in the perfection of the mind, a concession the illithid empire will never make. Thus, the mind flayers waited in the dark, their cold, pupilless eyes staring up at the stone ceilings of their subterranean vaults, their collective consciousness humming with the mathematical certainty of their eventual return. They cared nothing for the dead three, for the tablets of fate, or for the weeping, passionate gods of Toril. They operated on a timeline measured in geological epochs, slowly gathering their strength, experimenting with their terrifying biological sciences, and waiting for the precise moment when the mortal realms would grow too weak, too divided, and too blind to notice the shadows deepening around them. The universe, in their alien minds, was merely a grand, messy equation, and the grand design was the only acceptable solution. The intersection of this terrifying grand design with the recorded history of the Sword Coast is intimately and tragically tied to the legacy of a legendary human explorer named Baldurin. Exactly 4 centuries prior to the horrifying events that would come to be known as the Absolute Crisis, Baldurin was a famed adventurer and a remarkably daring sailor whose very blood seemed to sing with the crashing rhythms of the ocean tides. He was a man of immense charisma and insatiable curiosity, driven by a desire to chart the unknown horizons of the world. In an era when most sailors clung tightly to the familiar, mapped coastlines of Faerun out of a deeply ingrained fear of sea monsters and violent aquatic deities, Baldurin boldly steered his ship straight into the churning, mist-shrouded expanse of the trackless sea. After months of navigating treacherous waters and surviving the punishing gales of the open ocean, he eventually reached the shores of the distant mythic continent of Anchorome. When Baldurin finally returned to his homeland, his vessels sat low and heavy in the water, their hulls completely overflowing with vast, unimaginable wealth. He brought back exotic spices that smelled of burning copper and sweet earth, rare and luminescent magical artifacts, and crates overflowing with heavy, stamped gold. Instead of hoarding this monumental fortune or retreating into a life of quiet, selfish luxury, he invested the entirety of his newfound wealth into a modest, struggling coastal settlement known as Grey Harbor. Because of his grand vision and his immense financial infusion, that small, muddy harbor settlement rapidly expanded, its wooden docks replaced by heavy stone, its borders pushing outward until it subsequently grew into the towering, bustling metropolis of Baldur's Gate. The city became a jewel of the Sword Coast, a testament to the rewards of human ambition and the boundless courage of its founder. During his early, glorious adventures, Baldurin did not sail the treacherous seas or walk the perilous frontiers alone. He was faithfully accompanied by a magnificent, ancient being of immense power and profound nobility, Ansur, a majestic bronze dragon. Ansur was a creature of breathtaking beauty, his thick, interlocking scales shimmering with the warm, metallic hues of polished bronze, and the air around him perpetually carrying the sharp, clean scent of ozone and rain. The bond between the mortal explorer and the immortal dragon was forged in the fires of mutual respect and countless shared battles. So deep was their friendship, and so profound was the dragon's love for the city his friend had built, that Ansur earned the revered nickname, the Heart of the Gate, and he swore a solemn, binding promise to defend the city in times of ultimate peril. The citizens of Baldur's Gate slept soundly, comforted by the knowledge that beneath their cobblestones and behind their walls, an ancient, honorable worm stood as their eternal, vigilant guardian. However, the heart of a true sailor is never truly satisfied by the quiet safety of solid ground. Despite the immense wealth he had accumulated and the grand city that bore his name, Baldurin eventually felt the irresistible, pulling call of the sea once more. He commissioned a magnificent new ship, christened it the Wandering Eye, and with the wind filling its massive canvas sails, he launched a second voyage into the gray, misty unknown, seeking new lands and greater glories. The citizens waved from the docks, expecting their hero to return with another fleet of treasure. Instead, the Wandering Eye vanished into the deep fog, and Baldurin was lost to history, his fate remaining an unsolved, mournful mystery for centuries. The tragic, hidden historical record, however, reveals a narrative far darker than a simple disappearance at sea. Following a devastating shipwreck that splintered the wandering eye against unforgiving rocks, a desperate and exhausted Baldurin washed ashore, stripped of his glory and his wealth. Seeking survival, shelter, or perhaps a new fortune to rebuild his life, the stranded explorer made his way inland toward a towering, imposing structure known as Moonrise Towers. Unbeknownst to the famed adventurer, the shadows of the towers harbored a nightmare completely alien to his understanding of the world. Within the cold, subterranean depths of the fortress, he was ambushed and captured by a hidden coven of mind flayers who had established a secretive colony far beneath the earth. The hero of the Sword Coast, the man who had charted the trackless sea and founded a metropolis, was dragged into the lightless, brine-scented dark. He was strapped to a cold stone slab, entirely powerless as the terrifying, tentacled architects of the grand design descended upon him. In a cruel, agonizing biological violation, Baldurin was infected with an illithid tadpole. The parasitic creature was driven through his eye socket, sliding deep into the soft tissue of his mortal brain. Over the following days, the legendary explorer was subjected to the excruciating, irreversible horrors of ceramorphosis, his flesh melting and reshaping, his human bones shifting and elongating until he was completely transformed, becoming an illithid himself. The courageous soul of the sailor was seemingly extinguished, replaced entirely by the cold, calculating, and psionically dominant consciousness of a mind flayer. For many years, the creature that had once been Baldurin operated under the suffocating, collective control of the hidden hive mind. Eventually, however, through sheer anomalous force of will and mysterious cosmological circumstances that would not be fully understood until much later, this specific illithid managed to break free from the absolute dominance of the elder brain, retaining fragments of his original strategic genius, but none of his original human warmth. He took the new, grandiose moniker, the Emperor, and the transformed Baldurin returned to his city. He did not return to the sunlit plazas or the grand estates as a celebrated founder, but rather slipped into the damp, lightless sewers and the shadowed political backrooms, a silent, unseen parasite weaving itself into the very fabric of the city's leadership. The Emperor, applying the terrifying psionic capabilities of his new form, forged a deeply secretive and manipulative partnership with a prominent political figure, Duke Belen Stellman. He did not ask for her cooperation. He invaded her mind, turning her into a living, breathing puppet through which he could exert his will. Through this agonizing psychic subjugation, he established an insidious, sweeping control over the Knights of the Shield, a lawful, evil conglomerate of ruthless politicians, wealthy merchants, and information brokers who specialized in manipulating events from the shadows. The founder of the city was now its hidden, tentacled dictator, orchestrating trade agreements, assassinations, and political maneuvers with cold, flawless mathematical precision. In the freezing depths of his alien mind, the Emperor thoroughly rationalized his monstrous transformation. He did not view his condition as a curse or a tragedy, but rather, he came to believe that illithid evolution was an objective biological and intellectual upgrade. He looked upon the humans, elves, and dwarves, walking the streets above him, not as his former kin, but with the cold, detached superiority of a shepherd looking at a flock. In his deeply altered cognitive state, he viewed humanity merely as fragile, emotionally volatile beasts of burden, necessary only for the continuation of the city's machinery, but entirely inferior to the supreme elegance of psionic order. This complete psychological acceptance of his alien nature and his chilling detachment from mortal empathy created an insurmountable tragic rift between him and his oldest, most devoted friend, the ancient bronze dragon Ansur. Ansur, possessing senses far beyond those of mortal men, eventually discovered the horrific truth hidden beneath the city's streets. The dragon descended into the dark, seeking his beloved companion, only to find a cold, calculating monster wearing the twisted, mauve-skinned echoes of his friend's memories. Ansur, utterly horrified and heartbroken by Baldurin's condition, sought desperately to cure his friend's ceremorphosis, researching ancient magics and pleading with celestial powers, but no such cure existed in the entire cosmos. The transformation was absolute. The biology of the Mind Flayer was a permanent, irreversible rewrite of reality. As the years dragged on, the ancient dragon was forced to confront a devastating philosophical and emotional truth. Recognizing that the original vibrant soul of Baldurin was completely destroyed and entirely replaced by the alien consciousness of the illithid parasite, Ansur resolved to grant his former friend a merciful death. It was an act born not of hatred, but of profound love and sorrow, a desperate attempt to honor the memory of the great explorer by destroying the grotesque mockery that wore his face. The dragon cornered the emperor in the cavernous, echoing subterranean chambers hidden deep beneath the city. However, the emperor no longer possessed the honor or the emotional bonds of the man he once was. In an act of ruthless, cold-blooded self-preservation, the emperor did not accept the dragon's mercy, nor did he attempt to reason with his oldest companion. Instead, relying on the terrifying, paralyzing power of his psionic blasts, the emperor struck first, viciously slaying the majestic bronze dragon beneath the heavy stone foundations of Worm's Rock Fortress. The great beast fell, his shining bronze scales violently cracked, and his noble heart stopped by the very hands of the man he had sworn to protect. The Emperor's treacherous actions in those dark caverns reveal a profound pragmatism bordering on absolute psychopathy. He felt no genuine remorse for the slaughter of his oldest friend. Instead, he viewed his own continued survival as paramount, ruthlessly discarding his former human morality while managing to maintain a staggering, horrifying cognitive dissonance, genuinely convincing himself that he remained the invisible, necessary savior of Baldur's Gate. He believed that his cold intellect was the only thing standing between the city and total ruin, completely ignoring the reality that he had murdered its truest guardian to protect his own monstrous existence. The great bronze corpse of Ansur was left to rot in the dark, a silent, tragic monument to the terrifying absolute death of Baldurin's humanity, while the Emperor returned to his shadows, waiting for the cosmic pieces of a much larger, darker game to fall into place. While the Emperor lurked in the damp, sunless sewers of Baldur's Gate, rationalizing his monstrous transformation and waiting for the gears of his grand strategy to turn, the broader cosmos remained locked in a much older, far more expansive struggle. The Illithid Empire, despite its horrifying perfection, and the unyielding mathematics of its grand design was not entirely invincible. In the grand tapestry of cosmic history, for every absolute force of subjugation, the universe inevitably weaves a counterbalance of profound, violent liberation. Across the sprawling silver expanse of the multiverse, the only force historically capable of challenging the Illithid Empire is the Githyanki. To understand the bitter, tragic nature of the Githyanki, one must peer backward through the mists of time, returning to the absolute height of the Mind Flayer's dominance, a period when the lightless subterranean pens of countless worlds were filled with the broken, weeping ancestors of a race that did not yet have a name. Eons ago, before the very concept of human magic had been codified or the first stone of Baldur's Gate had been laid, these ancestors existed only as cattle. They were a subjugated, nameless people, bred for countless generations merely to serve as physical laborers and eventual biological sustenance for the elder brains. Their existence was a suffocating nightmare of perpetual telepathic dominance, their individual thoughts ruthlessly crushed under the overwhelming humming weight of the Illithid hive mind. Yet from the deepest depths of this unimaginable despair, a singular, brilliant spark of defiance ignited. A legendary warrior known as Mother Gith led a successful, multiverse-spanning slave rebellion that shattered the Illithid dominion. Mother Gith was not merely a warrior of unmatched physical prowess. She was a biological and metaphysical anomaly, a sudden, miraculous mutation born from the agonizing pressure of endless slavery. Gith possessed an innate, extraordinarily powerful psionic ability capable of disrupting the hive mind control of the elder brains. When she focused her profound will, her mind did not simply push back against the telepathic chains of her masters, it shattered them entirely. Her presence acted as a screaming, psychic static that severed the connection between the mind flayers and their central guiding intelligence, rendering the once perfect Illithid overseers deaf, disoriented, and vulnerable. Armed with silver swords, forged in secret, and wielding the terrifying power of her own mind, Mother Gith led her people out of the dark, slaughtering their tentacled oppressors and bringing the greatest empire the multiverse had ever known crashing down into dust and ruin. However, the euphoria of absolute liberation is often fleeting, swiftly replaced by the incredibly heavy, terrifying burden of self-determination. Standing amidst the burning wreckage of the Illithid nautiloid fleets, the newly freed race found themselves facing an agonizing question of identity and purpose. Without the unifying, crushing weight of their oppressors, the fundamental differences in their trauma began to surface. Following their liberation, an ideological schism divided the race. The survivors gathered beneath the alien skies of newly freed worlds, their voices rising in passionate, irreconcilable debate. On one side stood those who believed that the true victory over their former masters lay in overcoming the very concept of violence itself. The Githzerai, led by the deeply reflective spiritual leader Zerthimon, sought philosophical peace and introspection. They argued that holding on to the hatred and trauma of their enslavement would simply turn them into a new kind of monster, and they desired to retreat into the chaotic, swirling sanctuary of the plane of limbo, to master their minds and forge a society built upon enlightenment. On the other side stood those who found no comfort in the promise of quiet meditation. The Githyanki, led by Gith, desired the violent conquest of the plains to ensure they would never be enslaved again. Mother Gith, her soul permanently scarred by the horrors of the breeding pens, believed with absolute, unwavering certainty that the multiverse was inherently predatory. In her eyes, peace was merely an illusion, a temporary weakness that invited re-enslavement. She decreed that the only way to secure permanent safety was to become the undisputed, terrifying apex predators of existence, to conquer every realm and slaughter any entity that dared to oppose their supremacy. This unbridgeable philosophical divide fractured the once unified rebellion, breaking the newly freed people into two eternally warring factions. Driven by a burning paranoid need to militarize her people and prepare for endless planar warfare, Mother Gith recognized that her warriors, while formidable, required an overwhelming advantage to secure total dominion. To secure military supremacy, Gith and her chief advisor, a deeply ambitious and cunning spellcaster named Vlakith, traveled to the Nine Hells to broker a pact with Tiamat, the evil dragon goddess. They descended into the suffocating, sulfurous heat of the first layer of hell, a treacherous landscape of jagged obsidian and raining ash, walking fearlessly into the terrible lair of the five-headed queen of chromatic dragons. The negotiations in that dark, sweltering abyss remained shrouded in myth and terror. The result, however, changed the balance of power across the cosmos forever. This pact secured an eternal alliance with red dragons, providing the Githyanki with the ultimate aerial cavalry. The skies of the astral plane soon filled with the magnificent, terrifying silhouettes of massive red worms, their scales shining like freshly spilled blood, carrying silver-armored Githyanki knights into battle. It was a military force of unimaginable devastation. But this absolute supremacy was bought at a terrible, hidden cost. Mother Gith was summoned into Tiamat's domain and never returned. The great liberator, the woman who had shattered the chains of an entire race, simply vanished into the dark, suffocating depths of the infernal realm, leaving behind a profound and dangerous vacuum of power. The Githyanki knights waited upon the ashen plains for their beloved mother to emerge, but the heavy iron doors of Tiamat's sanctum remained tightly closed. Instead, from the rolling smoke and sulfur, a massive red dragon emerged. In her place, Tiamat's red dragon consort, Ephelimon, proclaimed that Vlakith would be the new sovereign of the Githyanki. The chief advisor, who had stood quietly in Gith's shadow, stepped forward to claim the absolute devotion of the people. The transition of power was swift, orchestrated with a chilling, pre-calculated efficiency that smelled of profound, premeditated betrayal. Vlakith discarded the mantle of the liberator, immediately restructuring the society into a rigid, unforgiving military dictatorship centered entirely upon her own absolute authority. Yet this dark usurpation of the throne did not go entirely unopposed. The bloodline of the great liberator still flowed, carrying within it the fierce, unyielding spirit of rebellion. This usurpation was fiercely contested by Orpheus, the prince of the comet, the first and only son of Mother Gith. Orpheus saw through the lies woven by the newly crowned queen and the red dragon consort. He understood that his mother had been traded away, her legacy stolen by an advisor whose thirst for power vastly eclipsed her dedication to their people's freedom. Inheriting his mother's anti-illithid psionic disruption capabilities, Orpheus rallied an elite honor guard and launched the War of the Comet against the traitorous Vlaakith. The astral plane became a theater of tragic, bloody civil war. Silver swords clashed in the timeless void as Githyanki fought Githyanki, the majestic red dragons roaring as the race tore itself apart in a desperate struggle for its own soul. Orpheus fought with the righteous, burning fury of a betrayed son, his innate psionic abilities proving devastatingly effective against the Queen's loyalists. Despite his immense power and the unwavering devotion of his honor guard, the Prince of the Comet was ultimately outmaneuvered by the profound, ancient treachery of the usurper. The official Githyanki histories, written by the victors and violently enforced upon every generation, dictate a grand, triumphant tale of Orpheus's swift defeat and death. In reality, Vlaakith recognized the immense strategic value of Orpheus's psionic abilities. She understood that simply killing the prince would waste a biological weapon of unparalleled importance. The Githyanki, despite their dragon riders, still deeply feared the lingering threat of the scattered mind flayers, and the prince was the only living being capable of generating the disruption field necessary to shield their minds from the elder brains. Rather than granting him a warrior's death, the treacherous queen orchestrated a fate of unimaginable, eternal cruelty. She secretly bound him in infernal chains within a remote corner of the astral plane, contained within an artifact known as the astral prism. The Prince of the Comet was locked away in a suffocating, timeless prison constructed of dark magic and jagged crystal. He was suspended in the silent void, completely paralyzed, his consciousness remaining fully awake and agonizingly aware of his own absolute defeat. He was forced to endure an eternity of isolation, his only company the cold, unforgiving reality of his chains. For millennia, successive iterations of the Lich Queen Vlaakith siphoned Orpheus's power to protect her empire from Illithid mental domination. Vlaakith prolonged her own life through dark, necromantic rituals, transitioning from a mortal queen into a terrifying undead lich, her flesh decaying as her grip on the throne grew ever tighter. She treated the imprisoned prince not as a living being, but as a magical battery, draining his innate protective psionics to shield her vast armadas as they conquered the multiverse. To ensure that no new rebellion could ever spark in his name, she embarked upon a brutal, systematic campaign of historical erasure, suppressing all historical texts mentioning the prince to maintain her autocratic, godlike rule over the creches. The name of Orpheus was violently stricken from the records, his face chiseled from the stone monuments, and the very memory of the true heir was deemed a heresy punishable by immediate, agonizing death. The Githyanki people grew to worship the very monster who had betrayed their founder, entirely unaware that their salvation lay screaming in silent, infernal chains, locked away in the dark, waiting for a profound cosmological crisis to finally shatter his prison. While the Githyanki and the Mind Flayers waged their silent, silver war across the timeless void of the astral plane, an entirely different, infinitely more visceral conflict was burning in the absolute depths of the cosmos. To comprehend the full, terrifying scope of the forces arrayed against the mortal realm, one must descend far beneath the sunlit surface of Toril, past the shadowy caverns of the Underdark, and plunge directly into the suffocating, sulphurous heat of the lower planes. Here, the very concepts of morality and suffering are entirely commodified. The 9 hells of Baldur, locked in the eternal blood war against the demonic hordes of the abyss, constantly seek mortal souls and strategic footholds to fuel their endless, incomprehensible military campaigns. The blood war is a conflict of such unimaginable scale and profound brutality that it makes the grandest mortal crusades look like petty tavern brawls. It is an absolute, unyielding clash between the rigid, tyrannical law of the devils and the consuming entropic chaos of the demons. Across the charred ashen plains of Avernus, the first and most heavily fortified layer of the 9 hells, the sky bleeds a perpetual, raining fire, and the ground is permanently slick with the boiling, foul ichor of billions of slaughtered combatants. The devils of Baldur do not view the vibrant, mortal world of Toril as a realm to be conquered through outright clumsy military invasion. Instead, their approach is infinitely more insidious. The machinations of the upper and lower planes consistently utilize Toril as a proxy battleground. The devils view the mortal cities, with all their desperate ambitions, their fragile loves, and their crippling fears, merely as vast, fertile fields waiting to be harvested for soldiers and currency. This infernal geopolitics found a perfect, terrifying nexus within the towering, fog-shrouded walls of Baldur's Gate. Before he ascended to become a central architect of the apocalyptic absolute crisis, Enver Gortash was simply a man of profound sociopathic ambition. Gortash, an arms dealer and ambitious politician, sought to secure an alliance with the archdevil Zariel to fund his megalomaniacal designs. He understood that true, unassailable power required resources that the mortal world simply could not provide. He needed infernal iron, a metal forged in the screaming heat of Avernus, to construct his mechanical armies. Furthermore, he needed the absolute binding backing of a cosmic powerhouse. However, archdevils do not trade their favors for mere gold or silver. They trade in absolute devotion, and they demand tokens of loyalty that permanently stain the mortal soul. To prove his loyalty and secure infernal iron, Gortash committed an act of staggering, cold-blooded betrayal. He did not offer his own blood, nor did he offer the lives of his enemies. He offered the life of his most trusted, devoted protector. Gortash betrayed Karlach Cliffgate, selling her directly to the archdevil. Karlach was a fierce tiefling barbarian, a woman whose physical strength was entirely eclipsed by the immense, vibrant warmth of her spirit. She had served as a fiercely loyal bodyguard for Enver Gortash in Baldur's Gate, viewing him not merely as an employer, but as a mentor who had pulled her from the gutters of the city. She had trusted him implicitly, ready to lay down her life to defend him against the shadows of the city. The betrayal shattered her world in an instant. Without warning, the protective walls of her home vanished, replaced by the screaming, burning expanse of the 9 hells and the terrifying, towering presence of Zariel, the fallen angel who ruled Avernus with an iron fist. The archdevil did not merely want Karlach to serve in her infantry. She saw in the fierce tiefling the perfect, resilient anatomy for a horrifying biological and mechanical augmentation. The Blood War's insatiable demand for martial excellence ensnared Karlach Cliffgate, dragging her directly into the darkest depths of the infernal war machine. Zariel utilized Karlach as an experimental subject dragging her to the burning anvils of the infernal foundries. In a procedure of unimaginable, agonizing cruelty, the archdevil's torturers cracked open the tiefling's chest and physically tore out her beating mortal heart. In its place, replacing her heart with an experimental infernal engine, transforming her into a devastating, unwilling champion on the front lines of Avernus. The infernal engine was a masterpiece of cruel, mechanical genius. It pumped searing liquid fire through her veins instead of blood, granting her a terrifying, explosive strength capable of cleaving through legions of abyssal horrors. Yet this power was an absolute, burning prison. The thermodynamic instability of the infernal engine meant that it could not safely operate on the material plane. If Karlach were ever to step out of the suffocating heat of the hells and into the cool, normal atmosphere of Toril, the engine would violently overheat, eventually incinerating her from the inside out. By replacing her heart with this volatile furnace, Zariel effectively imprisoned Karlach in hell, where she fought demons out of sheer survival instinct, day after agonizing day, entirely cut off from the cool rains and gentle winds of the home she had been ripped away from, while Karlach was forced to endure the agonizing physical fires of Avernus. Another profoundly tragic narrative of infernal manipulation was unfolding back in the shadowed streets of her home city. The devils of Baldur are masters of multitasking their malice. Parallel to Karlach's suffering was the tragedy of Will Ravengard, the only son of the esteemed Grand Duke Ulder Ravengard. Will was the absolute antithesis of Enver Gortash. Raised within the grand, vaulted halls of the upper city, he was taught to revere the law, to protect the innocent, and to uphold the highest principles of justice. The 17-year-old Will possessed a heart full of radiant idealism, entirely uncorrupted by the cynical politics that surrounded his father. He believed in the heroic tales of old, where good inevitably triumphed over evil through sheer, unwavering courage. However, the lower planes excel at identifying genuine goodness and twisting it into a weapon of absolute despair. Will was confronted with a catastrophic threat when a cult attempted to summon an aspect of Tiamat, the terrifying queen of evil dragons, to completely destroy Baldur's Gate. The young 17-year-old boy stood alone in the dark, watching in absolute paralyzing horror as the cultists chanted their foul incantations, preparing to unleash a cataclysm that would incinerate the entire city, his father, and every innocent soul within the walls. He had no army to call upon, no powerful magic of his own, and no time to alert the flaming fist. He possessed only his sword and his desperate, burning desire to save his home. In his moment of absolute, crushing desperation, the shadows of the ritual chamber shifted, and the air grew thick with the cloying, sweet scent of brimstone and roses. Will was approached by Mizora, a breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly cunning cambion in the direct service of Zariel. Mizora did not threaten him. She offered him salvation wrapped in a venomous smile. Mizora offered him the power to defeat the cultists in exchange for his soul. She presented him with an infernal pact, a magically binding document that promised to grant him the mystical strength necessary to crush the cult, but at the eternal cost of his own spiritual freedom. For a young man raised to prioritize the lives of the innocent above all else, there was only one acceptable choice. Will accepted, willingly sacrificing his eternal soul to secure the safety of Baldur's Gate, becoming the heavily bound warlock known as the Blade of Frontiers. He was granted immense dark power, and with it, he successfully drove the cultists back, stopping the summoning ritual and saving the lives of tens of thousands of citizens who would never even know his name. He had committed the ultimate act of heroism, yet the true horror of an infernal pact is rarely found in the granting of power. It is always found in the fine, invisible print of the aftermath. When Grand Duke Ulder Ravengard arrived at the scene of the battle, he did not find a triumphant hero. Mazora had meticulously swept the battlefield clean of all evidence of the cult of the dragon, entirely erasing the proof of the catastrophic threat Will had prevented. Instead, she masterfully framed Will's actions as a willing, arrogant descent into dark magic. When the Grand Duke demanded an explanation from his son, demanding to know why the boy reeked of sulfur and hellfire, Will opened his mouth to speak, to proudly explain that he had saved the city, but the words turned to ash in his throat. Mazora's precise contractual stipulations physically prevented Will from explaining the circumstances of the pact. The infernal magic bound his tongue, rendering him entirely mute on the subject of his own heroism. Grand Duke Ravengard, a man completely blinded by his absolute adherence to the law and unable to comprehend the terrible sacrifice his son had made, viewed Will only as a corrupted, treacherous warlock. Breaking his own heart, Ravengard exiled his son from the city, casting the 17-year-old hero out into the unforgiving wilderness. This heartbreaking event underscores a profound third-order insight into the true nature of the lower planes. Devils do not merely trade in souls, they actively weaponize mortal morality. Zariel and her servants did not need to tempt Will with greed, lust, or ambition. They understood that the strongest chain they could forge was forged from his own virtue. By forcing Will to choose between his beloved city's survival and his own eternal salvation, Mazora engineered a brilliant, sociopathic scenario where the ultimate act of good resulted directly in permanent social and spiritual damnation. Both Karlach and Will, two radiant souls driven by loyalty and justice, found themselves entirely consumed by the infernal geopolitics of Avernus. One was physically trapped in the burning fires of hell, her body hollowed out to serve as a biological weapon, while the other was emotionally trapped in a freezing exile, his reputation destroyed, and his soul bound to the very shadows he had sworn to fight. Their profound, agonizing tragedies serve as a grim testament to the fact that in the grand, sweeping games played by the absolute powers of the cosmos, mortals are rarely recognized as players. They are only ever the pieces waiting to be sacrificed upon the board. The grand tragedies of the lower planes and the shattered empires of the cosmos eventually bled back into the mortal realm, drawn by the desperate hunger of fallen gods. While the catastrophic events in Baldur's Gate eventually brought the Lord of Murder back from the grave, the cosmic reality of his return was far less triumphant than the ancient prophecies had promised. The bloody, terrifying resurrection of Baal and the stubborn, lingering survival of Bane and Mirkul did not immediately restore their former glory. The universe had moved on without them, the heavy machinations of the cosmos grinding forward while they had languished in the shadows. Instead of reclaiming their absolute, unquestionable dominance over the pantheon, they were relegated to the diminished pathetic status of quasi-deities, heavily reliant on their mortal chosen to enact their will upon the physical world. To be a quasi-deity is to exist in a state of perpetual, agonizing starvation. They possess the vast, incomprehensible memories of true godhood. They remembered sculpting reality, extinguishing stars, and commanding the absolute devotion of millions. But they were entirely stripped of the metaphysical machinery required to exert that power directly. They were forced to whisper from the shadows, to beg for scraps of worship, and to rely on the frail, unpredictable vessels of mortal flesh to carry out their designs. Yet the arrogance that had driven them to challenge Jergal in the ancient gray waste remained entirely intact. To reclaim absolute dominion over Toril, the Dead Three orchestrated a conspiracy of unprecedented complexity, a plot that moved far beyond simple murder or political tyranny, leveraging the alien terror of illithid biology and the forbidden world-breaking power of ancient Netherese magic. The gods themselves could not walk the earth to assemble the pieces of this apocalyptic puzzle, so they poured their dark blessings into perfectly forged mortal instruments. The chief architects of this terrifying conspiracy were Enver Gortash, who had been elevated to the Chosen of Bane, and a deeply horrifying, unnamed entity known only as the Dark Urge, who served as the Chosen of Baal. Gortash provided the cunning, the political infrastructure, and the smiling, tyrannical face necessary to manipulate the masses. But the Dark Urge was something entirely different, a creature that defied the very laws of nature and morality. The history of the Pile Spawn was already written in rivers of blood, but the Dark Urge was an anomaly that made the butchers of the previous century look like mere amateurs. Unlike traditional Pile Spawn, who were born of the messy, unpredictable process of mortal reproduction, the Dark Urge was a masterpiece of profane, anatomical artistry. This entity was meticulously crafted directly from a piece of Baal's own dead flesh. The Lord of Murder had taken the rotting divine meat of his own corpse, molded it, and breathed his foul essence into it, creating a perfect living weapon. Because it was forged purely from the concentrated essence of death, the Dark Urge possessed an inescapable, woven-in biological imperative for murder. For the Dark Urge, the act of slaughter was not a choice, nor was it driven by anger, greed, or political ambition. It was a fundamental biological necessity, as necessary and as autonomic as drawing breath or the beating of a heart. The urge to kill hummed in their veins, an agonizing physical itch under the skin that could only be temporarily soothed by the spilling of hot blood. Together, the calculating tyrant and the perfect murderer looked upon the world and decided it was entirely insufficient. They needed an instrument of absolute control, a weapon capable of subjugating not just a city, but the entire biological and magical architecture of the Sword Coast. Driven by this staggering, apocalyptic ambition, the Dark Urge and Gortash devised a plot of profound madness to steal the crown of Karsus directly from the heavily guarded, infernal vaults of the archdevil Mephistopheles. To fully comprehend the sheer, unadulterated hubris of this heist, one must understand the terrible history bound within the cold metal of that artifact. The Crown of Karsus is an artifact of apocalyptic significance, a relic hailing from a golden, forgotten age when mortal magic was not merely a tool, but a force capable of terrifying the heavens. Long before the current era, the sprawling empire of Netheril ruled the skies of Toril. The Netherese were a civilization of supreme arcane mastery, dwelling in magnificent, floating cities suspended high above the clouds by the sheer force of their magical ingenuity. They commanded the elements, twisted the fabric of reality to their whims, and eventually their arrogance grew so vast that they ceased to view the gods as superiors. In the ancient, glittering era of Netheril, the most brilliant and deeply arrogant archwizard of them all, a man named Karsus, attempted the ultimate transgression. Seeking to elevate his empire to eternal, untouchable supremacy, Karsus attempted to directly usurp the divine portfolio of the goddess Mistriel using a monumental 12th level super spell. Modern spellcasters struggle to master the ninth circle of magic, finding it exhausting to bend the weave to such extremes. Karsus, however, constructed a spell so incredibly complex and aggressively powerful that it aimed to entirely consume the original goddess of magic, draining her essence and transferring the absolute control of the universal weave into his own mortal mind. The casting of this spell was the most devastating magical disaster in the history of the cosmos. As Karsus unleashed his 12th level incantation, the delicate, intricate tapestry of the weave violently buckled under the immense strain of his mortal ambition. This act of supreme hubris, historically recorded and mourned as Karsus's folly, caused the immediate, catastrophic, and temporary collapse of the weave itself. The invisible threads of magic that held the universe together simply snapped. The magnificent, floating enclaves of Netheril immediately lost their buoyancy, plummeting from the sky and shattering against the earth in a deafening, world-ending rain of stone and fire. Millions of lives were extinguished in a matter of seconds. Recognizing that Karsus's spell would completely unmake the entire metaphysical structure of reality, the goddess Mistriel made a heartbreaking, ultimate choice. The crisis necessitated Mistriel's absolute self-sacrifice and her subsequent, painful rebirth as the new goddess Mystra. By severing her own existence, she broke the connection to the archwizard, stabilizing the weave just long enough to save the world, though the Netherese empire was permanently reduced to ash. The physical focal point of Karsus's grand, failed ascension was a grand diadem, and the crown contained this incredibly volatile, unstable Netherese magic. It was a halo forged from the death of an empire and the sacrifice of a god, radiating a power that was never meant to be touched again. This terrifying artifact had eventually fallen into the freezing, hoarding clutches of Mephistopheles, the Lord of No Mercy, who locked it deep within the 8th layer of the 9 hells. The realm of Cania is a wasteland of absolute, paralyzing cold, a domain of towering glaciers and howling, freezing winds that turn mortal flesh to brittle ice in mere moments. It is a fortress designed to keep the greatest secrets of the multiverse buried forever. Yet the chosen of Bane and the chosen of Baal were entirely undeterred by the impossible odds. To execute their impossible infiltration and penetrate the frozen depths of Mephistopheles' vault, Gortash and the Dark Urge realized they could not simply march an army into the 9 hells. They needed a backdoor, a surgical tear in the fabric of the planes. To achieve this, they enlisted the services of Helsik, a deeply pragmatic and exceptionally powerful diabolist operating a secretive shop within the winding, fog-choked streets of Baldur's Gate. For an exorbitant sum of gold and the promise of future infernal favors, Helsik agreed to utilize her dark expertise to open a direct, localized portal to Khania. Standing in the dimly lit, incense-heavy air of the Diabolist's parlor, the tyrant and the perfect murderer watched as the magical tear ripped open, revealing the swirling, blinding blizzards of the eighth hell. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, frost creeping across the wooden floorboards as the howling winds of Khania reached out toward them. Steeling themselves against the supernatural cold, the two mortal architects stepped through the rift, carrying with them the dark blessings of their diminished gods, preparing to steal the most dangerous artifact in existence and set the stage for an absolute, magnificent catastrophe. The biting, supernatural winds of Khania could not freeze the burning ambition of the two mortal conquerors. They emerged from the Diabolus portal not as mere thieves, but as the arrogant architects of a dark, new age, clutching the magnificent and terrifying crown of Karsus. The artifact pulsed with a sick, magenta light in the shadowed parlor, radiating the sheer, volatile force of collapsed Nether's magic. Yet possessing the crown was only the first step in their grand, apocalyptic design. To wield this world-breaking artifact as a weapon of mass theological manipulation, they required a biological anchor of unparalleled intellectual capacity. Upon securing the crown, Enver Gortash and the Dark Urge sought out a crucial third ally, traveling through the heavy, suffocating darkness of the shadow-cursed lands to ally with Catherick Thorm, the chosen of Merkel. Thorm was a towering, imposing figure of endless sorrow and necrotic resilience, a man who had already died and returned, bound in absolute willing servitude to the Lord of Bones. Thorm provided the exact, horrifying anchor they needed, a captive elder brain securely located in the sprawling, lightless Illithid colony hidden deep beneath the stone foundations of Moonrise Towers. The three chosen descended into the deep, brine-scented depths of the subterranean colony. The elder brain floated within its vast, murky pool, a pulsing, magnificent mass of ancient, Illithid consciousness, humming with the terrifying, suffocating psionic weight of 1,000 consumed minds. To an ordinary mortal, merely standing in its presence would invite instant, agonizing madness or a catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage. But the chosen of the dead three were shielded by the dark blessings of their diminished gods, and they carried the devastating legacy of Karsus. With a chilling, triumphant precision, they achieved the impossible. By placing the heavy, metallic ring of the crown of Karsus upon the heavily ridged surface of the elder brain, they forcefully subjugated its immense will. The unstable Netherese magic flared brilliantly, driving metaphysical spikes deep into the alien entity's consciousness, agonizingly binding the vast, ancient intelligence to the spoken commands of the three mortals. They transformed the ancient, proud creature into the Netherbrain, the central, enslaved node of a fabricated, manufactured deity known to its future followers as the Absolute. The theological mechanics of this plot were deeply insidious, a masterpiece of metaphysical exploitation designed to starve the rest of the Faerunian pantheon while feeding the dead three. The true nature of divine power across the cosmos relies heavily upon genuine mortal faith. The gods are sustained by the prayers, the hopes, and the willing devotion of their followers. The dead three, relegated to the pathetic status of quasi-deities, intended to steal this devotion by absolute force. The chosen intended to infect the unsuspecting populace of the Sword Coast with illithid tadpoles, but with a terrifying magical modification that defied the natural laws of seramorphosis. Under normal biological circumstances, an illithid tadpole consumes a host's brain in a matter of days, resulting in a swift, violent transformation into a mind flayer. However, these specific parasites were placed and suspended in a state of absolute stasis by the Netherbrain's immense commanded magic. The infected victims retained their outward physical appearance, their vibrant personalities, and their treasured memories, entirely unaware that a dormant, tentacled monster slept quietly behind their eyes. These infected individuals, indoctrinated through the subtle, continuous telepathic whispers of the Netherbrain and the terrifying, charismatic influence of the cult's mortal leaders, became known throughout the region as true souls. They were drawn from every walk of life: noble paladins, desperate peasants, wealthy merchants, and cunning thieves, all united under the false, comforting banner of a new god. When these true souls knelt to pray to the Absolute, genuinely believing they were worshiping a benevolent deity of perfect order and unity, the magical stasis of the tadpole acted as a spiritual siphon. They would inadvertently sacrifice the vibrant spiritual energy of their souls directly to the dead three, completely bypassing the silent Judge Lord Ao's strict, ancient divine strictures on genuine worship. It was a cosmic heist of unparalleled scale and brilliance, stealing the very essence of faith from the hearts of thousands without them ever realizing they were being slowly drained to feed the weakened gods of death and tyranny. However, while Enver Gortash envisioned himself ruling forever over a perfectly ordered, emotionally suppressed empire of living, breathing puppets, the dark urge harbored a far more terrifying, final objective. The dark urge's ultimate goal was a state of nihilistic perfection, a silence so profound that it would echo across the empty cosmos forever. For the perfect biological weapon of Baal, the vast, continent-spanning empire of the Absolute was merely a temporary fleshy scaffolding. Their true, burning desire was to eventually drop the magical stasis holding the millions of tadpoles, triggering sudden, simultaneous seramorphoses across the entire face of the world. The plan was to create a massive, unstoppable army of soulless mind flayers, specifically designed to systematically exterminate all remaining life on the world of Toril. Once the planet was reduced to a silent, blood-soaked graveyard floating in the void, the Dark Urge intended to end the apocalyptic campaign with their own quiet suicide, thus perfectly fulfilling the Lord of Murder's ultimate mandate of absolute death. Yet, the grand, terrible alliance of the Dead Three was fundamentally poisoned by the very nature of the dark gods they served. Treachery is the native tongue of the lower planes, and it soon echoed violently within the hidden ranks of the Absolute. The alliance was violently and irreparably fractured by internal betrayal before the grand design could reach its bloody conclusion. Within the deepest, most shadowed ranks of the polished cult, a lesser, deeply chaotic figure lurked resentfully in the imposing shadow of the Dark Urge. Orin the Red, a lesser Pelspawn, and a subordinate entirely obsessed with the grotesque artistry of flayed flesh and the theatricality of murder, harbored a burning, venomous jealousy toward her master's cold, calculating perfection. Orin did not view murder as a sacred, silent duty. She viewed it as a loud, messy performance, and she deeply despised the quiet discipline of her superior. Driven by a desperate, frantic need to claim her dead father's absolute favor, Orin launched a sudden, brutal surprise attack on her master in the dark. The ambush was not a clean, honorable assassination, but a profound, degrading violation of the mind and body. Through sheer chaotic ferocity, she managed to overpower the dark urge. In a terrifying twist of poetic cruelty, she subjected the perfect killer to the very weapon they had helped forge to subjugate the masses. She forcefully infected the dark urge with an illithid tadpole, ruthlessly wiped their memories entirely clean through a combination of physical trauma and parasitic interference, and triumphantly usurped the bloody mantle of Baal's chosen for herself. The grand, silent architect of the Absolute's apocalyptic endgame was instantly reduced to a drooling, amnesiac shell, casually discarded and left to wander the dangerous wilderness, with a parasite chewing at the edges of a completely forgotten mind. This sudden, bloody change in leadership severely damaged the operational efficiency of the Dark Triumvirate. Enver Gortash was deeply horrified by the usurpation, though the smiling tyrant dared not show his true fear to the newly crowned, deeply unstable chosen of murder. Gortash viewed Orin as an unpredictable, chaotic liability compared to the cold, mathematical precision of the Dark Urge. Where the Dark Urge killed with grand, strategic purpose to advance the plot of the Absolute, Orin killed simply because she liked the bright color of the blood on the cobblestones. Her theatrical, highly public massacres threatened to draw the attention of the authorities and adventuring parties far too early, jeopardizing the delicate, secretive expansion of the cult across the Sword Coast. The absence of the dark urge's stabilizing, terrifying focus caused the remaining chosen to bicker endlessly, their secret meetings devolving into petty, screaming threats and paranoid, exhausting accusations. This profound internal division was the fatal flaw in their grand, overarching design. The mortal chosen believed that because they held the glowing crown of Karsus, they held absolute, unquestionable control over the magnificent, ancient intelligence trapped beneath its metal bands. They were entirely, catastrophically mistaken in their arrogance. The endless infighting and the sloppy, uncoordinated execution of their plans presented the enslaved Netherbrain with the crucial opportunity to begin formulating its own counter-strategy for ultimate liberation. The Netherbrain floated silently in its dark, briny pool deep beneath Moonrise Towers, projecting a flawless aura of perfect, broken compliance to its arrogant mortal masters. But beneath the rippling surface of the water, its vast, alien intellect began to weave a new, infinitely more complex psionic equation. It observed the fractured alliance with cold, pupilless calculation, measuring the precise weight of Orin's madness against Gortash's overwhelming arrogance. It did not struggle against the Netherese spikes in its mind. Instead, it patiently began to map out the exact, delicate sequence of events required to turn the mortal's own dark ambitions into the precise instrument of their total, unavoidable annihilation. The true threat was no longer the dead three, but the waiting, calculating silence of the mind they thought they had broken. While the enslaved Netherbrain quietly calculated its own liberation deep within the subterranean colony, the surface of the world above it was already choking beneath a suffocating blanket of historical misery. The operational headquarters of the Absolute Cult was established at Moonrise Towers, a fortress completely surrounded by the impenetrable, unnatural darkness of the Shadow Curse. To look upon Moonrise Towers in the era of the Absolute was to gaze upon a monument to absolute despair, yet it was not always a place of horror. Centuries prior, it stood as a magnificent beacon of silver light, a grand architectural tribute to Selûne, the goddess of the moon and creation. The profound corruption of Moonrise Towers and the surrounding lands was the direct result of the deeply personal, agonizing historical tragedies surrounding a man named Ketheric Thorm. Ketheric was once a towering figure of nobility and grace, a devout and unwavering follower of Selûne, whose faith burned as brightly as the stars. He was a man who possessed everything a mortal heart could desire: a prosperous land to govern, a deep, unshakable connection to the divine, and most importantly, a profoundly loving family. However, the cosmic scales are rarely kind to those who stand in the light. Ketheric's descent into madness began with a slow, creeping sorrow. He fell into a suffocating despair following the tragic death of his beloved wife, Melodia. The loss hollowed him out, leaving a cold, echoing void within his chest that even the comforting light of his goddess struggled to warm. He poured all his remaining love and all his desperate, overprotective anxiety into his only remaining joy, his bright and beautiful daughter, Isabel. Then, the ultimate, unthinkable tragedy struck. Isabel, the final tether holding Ketheric's sanity to the mortal world, was suddenly and violently taken from him in her youth. The exact circumstances surrounding Isabel's untimely demise are shrouded in the misty, unreliable fog of historical regret. Archdruid Halsin, a key and highly respected leader of the Emerald Grove, carried immense crippling survivor's guilt regarding these chaotic events. Deep within the fragmented, theoretical apocrypha that persists in the margins of older timelines, there are whispers of a terrible accident. These obscure historical records suggest that Halsin may have accidentally struck down Isabel during a chaotic, confused conflict using a deeply cursed, sentient glaive named Sorrow. Whether this was the absolute truth or merely the paranoid delusion of a grieving father, the outcome remained the same. This singular, agonizing moment directly triggered Ketheric's sudden, absolute descent into unrecoverable madness. When a mortal heart is subjected to that level of absolute suffocating grief, it seeks any available refuge from the pain. Ketheric stood over the cold, lifeless body of his only daughter, his faith in the goddess of light shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Driven entirely by this blinding, consuming grief, Thorm turned his back on the moon and turned instead to Shar, the ancient goddess of darkness and oblivion. Shar did not offer him comfort, nor did she offer the false hope of a joyful afterlife. She offered him the cold, numbing embrace of absolute forgetfulness. In exchange for her dark blessings, Ketheric transformed Moonrise Towers into a fortress of weeping shadows, raising a terrifying, fanatical army of elite warriors known as the Dark Justiciars to enforce Shar's entropic will across the region. The surrounding lands wept under his tyrannical sorrow. The combined forces of the light could not allow this dark expansion to continue. Ketheric was ultimately defeated by a desperate, massive coalition of noble harpers and fierce druids who laid a brutal siege to the fortress. The battle was catastrophic, the stone walls cracking under the weight of powerful elemental magic and the clash of enchanted steel. Thorm was struck down, his armor shattered, and his body broken. But in his final agonizing moments, refusing to yield the land back to the light, he unleashed a horror upon the region. He unleashed the devastating shadow curse, a direct, terrifying manifestation of Shar's entropic will that violently twisted the land into a lightless environment permanently hostile to all natural life. The trees withered and twisted into jagged claws, the soil turned black and sour, and any living creature caught within the heavy, suffocating fog was slowly drained of its vitality, transforming into a weeping, violent shadow. Ketheric Thorm was dead, buried in a magnificent mausoleum beneath the cursed earth. But the grave offers no permanent sanctuary for a soul carrying that much bitter resentment. Decades later, a new voice whispered into the dark of his tomb. It was not the cold, forgetting voice of Shar, but the rotting, necromantic rasp of Mirkul, the Lord of Bones. Thorm was later pulled back from the abyss and resurrected as the immortal chosen of Mirkul. However, Mirkul did not simply breathe life back into the rotting corpse. He granted his new general an invincible, terrifying edge. Ketheric was granted complete immortality by performing a ritual of unimaginable cruelty. He utilized ancient magic to physically chain the Aasimar Dame Island, also known in mythological texts as the Night Song, within the desolate, colorless dimension of the Shadowfell. Dame Island was not a mere mortal. She was the divine daughter of Selûne herself. By keeping her eternally imprisoned in the dark, constantly dying and resurrecting in endless agony, Ketheric was actively siphoning her eternal life force across the planes, rendering himself completely invulnerable to any physical or magical harm on the material plane. With an immortal, unkillable general leading their forces, the Cult of the Dead Three was able to establish a terrifying foothold in the region, operating under the dark, manipulative banner of the Absolute. The cult utilized insidious, creeping mind control to systematically recruit formidable warriors from across the Sword Coast to bolster their ranks. The stasis-suspended tadpoles provided the perfect silent leash, turning proud, independent fighters into unquestioning zealots. Among these tragic, enslaved recruits was a woman of terrifying reputation. Minthara, a fiercely proud, loath-sworn drow paladin originating from the prestigious Benry noble house deep within the subterranean city of Menzoberranzan. To understand Minthara's profound tragedy, one must understand the environment that forged her. Drow society is an underground nightmare defined entirely by ruthless betrayal, systemic trauma, and constant calculated political assassination. In Menzoberranzan, weakness is a terminal disease, and love is merely a weapon used to extract concessions. Minthara was a product of this brutal environment. She was no stranger to violence, having spent her entire life stepping over the poisoned corpses of her rivals to secure her family's dominance. She possessed an iron will, a razor-sharp tactical mind, and a pride as unyielding as the darkest obsidian. Hearing whispers of a new, rising power that threatened the established order of the Underdark, the paladin sought to uncover the truth. However, upon investigating the growing cult of the Absolute, her formidable martial prowess and her deeply ingrained paranoia were entirely insufficient against the alien terror of the Mind Flayers. She was ambushed, overwhelmed, and captured in the dark. The proud noble of House Benry was strapped to a chair, her eyes held wide open as a writhing tadpole was violently forced into her mind. She was tadpoled and immediately subjected to complete, agonizing psychological subjugation. The violation of Minthara's mind was an absolute tragedy. Her iron will, forged through decades of surviving the deadliest city in the Underdark, was simply erased by the humming, overwhelming static of the Netherbrain. Completely stripped of her agency, she forgot her noble lineage, her goddess, and her own profound pride. She was reduced to a biological puppet, and she served as a brutal, efficient commander for the cult, orchestrating raids and slaughtering innocents in the name of a false god she would have ordinarily despised. She was a prisoner in her own skull, screaming silently into the void as her body committed unspeakable atrocities. She remained trapped in this absolute nightmare until, by sheer cosmological fortune, her heavy mental conditioning was suddenly and violently broken by the close proximity and the disruptive presence of the astral prism. When the suffocating fog in her mind finally cleared, the realization of what had been done to her crashed down with the weight of a collapsing mountain. Once freed, her defining motivation transitioned instantly from a blank, forced zealotry to an all-consuming burning desire for total vengeance against the unseen entities that had so thoroughly violated her mind and stolen her absolute sovereignty. She stood amidst the shadows of the cursed lands, her heart filled with a dark, freezing fury, realizing that the greatest horrors of the multiverse were not the betrayals of her kin in the Underdark, but the silent, calculating gods and monsters who dared to treat a mortal mind as a mere plaything. While the mortal chosen squabbled and plotted in the heavily shadowed halls of Moonrise Towers, entirely blind to the immense magnitude of the intelligence they believed they had chained, the enslaved entity began to enact its own silent, flawless rebellion. The Netherbrain floated within its vast, murky pool of metallic-tasting brine, projecting an aura of complete, broken submission to its arrogant captors. But deep within its alien, deeply ridged architecture, it calculated 1,000 possible futures simultaneously, its thoughts moving with a speed that would shatter a human skull. It understood the supreme cosmological value of the astral prism, recognizing with perfect clarity that the crystalline artifact contained the imprisoned prince of the comet and the exact psionic disruption field required to sever the absolute, agonizing control of the crown of Karsus. The Netherbrain, exploiting the discord among its captors, strategically leaked the location of the astral prism to the Githyanki to provoke an attack. The grand intelligence of the Illithid simply set the cosmic dominoes in motion, anticipating that bringing the artifact into play would disrupt the Chosen's control, introducing a violent, chaotic variable that Enver Gortash and Orin the Red could never mathematically predict or contain. Simultaneously, the dark goddess Shar, ever watchful from the suffocating, silent oblivion of her domain, turned her cold gaze toward the unfolding crisis. Sensing the immense, reality-altering power of the artifact moving through the plains, a Sharan cloister in Baldur's Gate dispatched a strike team to secure the prism. This was not a grand, marching army of armored knights, but a highly specialized, desperate suicide squad trained to move unseen through the darkest corners of the world, willing to lay down their lives for the Lady of Loss. This strike team was led by a young, fiercely devoted woman known as Shadowheart. Though she wore the heavy, dark armor of a Sharon cleric and carried a shield embossed with the symbol of the dark moon, she was born under the bright and hopeful name of Genevieve Hallowleaf. Shadowheart's history is a profound, terrifying study in the deliberate weaponization of memory. Her very existence was a tragic testament to the absolute, unyielding cruelty of the goddess of night. Abducted as a mere child by the ruthless Mother Superior, Viconia de Vere, on the direct orders of Shar, Genevieve was subjected to decades of psychological torture. She was stolen from a warm, bright home filled with the gentle silver light of the moon and dragged violently down into the lightless, echoing halls of the cloister of somber embrace. The Sharons did not merely break her physical body. They systematically and meticulously dismantled her soul. They repeatedly utilizing the mirror of loss to wipe her memories, a process of unimaginable tearing agony. The young girl was forced to stare into the cold, obsidian glass of the dark artifact, feeling the visceral sensation as her most precious, comforting memories were physically extracted from her mind, leaving behind only a freezing, empty void where a mother's smile or a father's laugh used to be. The absolute horror of her indoctrination reached depths of depravity that defy basic mortal comprehension. In a display of profound, sickening cruelty designed to completely sever her ties to the light, the young brainwashed initiate was forced to practice brutal interrogation techniques on her own parents. Her mother and father, the very people who had once held her in the sunlight, were secretly kept prisoner in the cloister of somber embrace. Their bodies were broken upon the rack, while their own daughter, entirely stripped of her recognition and convinced they were simply enemies of the dark, inflicted pain upon them in the name of a false, empty devotion. Shar's manipulation went as far as cursing Shadowheart with a magical wound. This jagged, dark mark upon her hand was not a mere scar, but a living, pulsing punishment. It flared with blinding, paralyzing pain whenever she experienced a moment of genuine emotion or encountered wolves. This terrifying phobia was implanted to distort the memory of her Selonite father trying to save her, twisting the courageous image of a desperate parent into the snapping, monstrous jaws of a beast. Despite the immense, overwhelming odds against her, Shadowheart emerged as the sole survivor of the Sharon suicide mission to secure the astral prism. Bleeding, entirely exhausted, and clutching the glowing crystalline artifact tightly to her chest, she carried the artifact onto the Illithid nautiloid where the crisis truly began. This alien vessel was a waking nightmare given physical form, a massive, spiraling shell of biomechanical flesh that drifted silently through the cosmos. Its interior was a claustrophobic labyrinth of pulsing purple veins, soft, wet membranes, and the overwhelming scent of copper and brine. On this vessel, several extraordinary individuals were violently infected with illithid tadpoles, forming an involuntary vanguard against the coming dark. They were snatched from entirely different lives, trapped in fleshy, suffocating stasis pods, and forced to endure the agonizing, squelching intrusion of the parasite sliding directly behind their eyes. Among this deeply traumatized group of survivors was Gale Decarios, a man of staggering intellect and catastrophic world-altering hubris. He was the former chosen of Maestra, a wizard who had once walked the celestial halls and touched the very fabric of divine creation. But his ambition had vastly eclipsed his wisdom. Attempting to prove his absolute mastery over the arcane, Gale was fused with the Netherese orb after attempting to master Karsite magic. Now, an unstable swirling vortex of pure destructive weave resided directly within his chest, glowing with an angry, volatile purple light. He was required to consume magic to prevent a city-leveling detonation, forced into living every single day as a terrified, ticking martyr. The squirming tadpole in his mind was a terrible threat, but it paled in comparison to the apocalyptic bomb resting heavily against his own heart. Trapped in a nearby pod within the fleshy walls of the ship was Astarion, a pale, elegant creature who had not felt the warmth of the sun upon his skin in over 200 years. He was a vampire spawn, entirely enslaved by Cazador Sar for 2 centuries. For Astarion, those 200 years were an eternity of suffocating darkness, forced to consume the foul blood of rats and entirely stripped of his bodily autonomy by the cruel, sadistic commands of his master. The sudden intrusion of the illithid parasite, however, brought a terrifying, twisted miracle to the vampire. The tadpole freed him from compulsion. He could suddenly walk in the blinding light of day without turning to ash, and he could finally say no to the dark whispers of his master. But this newfound, intoxicating freedom presented the profound moral dilemma of the Black Mass ritual. Astarion knew that to secure true, absolute freedom and ensure he could never be commanded again, he would eventually face the overwhelming temptation of sacrificing 7,000 spawn for ultimate power, a choice that would permanently define his soul. This desperate vanguard was forged in the screaming fires of mutual infection and crashing flesh. Beside the wizard and the vampire stood Lae'zel, the fierce, unyielding Githyanki warrior zealously devoted to Vlaakith. She viewed the writhing tadpole entirely as a mark of failure and sought immediate, brutal purification at Kresh Yilek, entirely unaware that she was about to discover her queen's absolute treachery. They were joined by Karlach, the towering champion of Avernus, who had finally escaped the blood war but still carried the unstable infernal engine burning within her chest. She faced the horrific reality of burning alive if she remained out of hell, her freedom coming at the cost of her own impending incineration. And fighting beside them in the wreckage was Will, the noble blade of frontiers, securely bound to Mizora. He was forced to navigate the treacherous, agonizing stipulations of his infernal pact while desperately attempting to rescue his father, Duke Ravengard, from the suffocating clutches of the Absolute. The invisible threads of destiny pulled incredibly tight, drawing heroes from across the centuries into the absolute center of the crisis. As the infected vanguard eventually fought their way out of the wilderness and toward the city, their ranks were destined to swell with the weight of history. They were later joined by the legendary harpers Jaheira and Minsk. Jaheira, a wise and battle-hardened druid, having survived the Palspawn crisis a century prior, had established a secretive harper network and raised a family in Baldur's Gate, watching with a heavy, sorrowful heart as the familiar, bloody shadows of her youth returned to haunt the city. Minsk, the legendary and boisterous ranger, alongside his miniature giant space hamster Boo, had been tragically petrified for decades, a perfect statue of heroics trapped in time. He was only recently freed from his stone prison and subsequently tadpoled by the cult to serve as their mindless, brutal enforcer, the Stone Lord, before being mercifully rescued and restored to his true, heroic self by the Vanguard. Together, this fractured, traumatized collection of mortals stood entirely alone, the only living barrier remaining between the fragile world of Toril and the absolute, consuming dark. As the fractured, deeply traumatized Vanguard moved through the heavily shadowed wilderness toward the city of Baldur's Gate, they were shielded from the absolute, commanding voice of the Netherbrain by the mysterious, shimmering power of the astral prism. For weeks, they had carried the crystalline artifact, believing it to be a mere talisman, a lucky cosmic shield that miraculously silenced the squelching psychic demands of the tadpoles resting behind their eyes. The truth of their survival, however, was a profound and terrifying revelation of utilitarian cruelty. When the Vanguard finally managed to peer beyond the jagged, translucent walls of the artifact and into the pocket dimension held within, they did not find a magical spell or a divine blessing. They found the Emperor, the cold, calculating Illithid who had once been the legendary human explorer Balduran. The Emperor resided within the silent, gravity-defying void of the astral prism, and he was not acting alone. The secret to his protective shield and the terrifying mechanism keeping the Vanguard from instantly transforming into mind flayers was the continuous, agonizing exploitation of Prince Orpheus. The true heir of the Githyanki, the Prince of the Comet, hung suspended in the center of the crystalline void, his limbs securely bound by glowing, infernal chains of thick, dark magic. The prince was completely paralyzed, his eyes burning with an unquenchable, silent fury. He was forced to watch in absolute horror as the Emperor, acting with a chilling, mathematical pragmatism, systematically siphoned his innate, anti-Illithid psionic disruption field. The Emperor did not view Orpheus as a tragic victim of political betrayal. He viewed the prince merely as a biological battery, a necessary living resource that had to be continuously drained to extend their protective barrier over the Vanguard. The Emperor communicated with the Vanguard through seamless telepathy, his psychic voice a smooth, reasonable hum that perfectly masked the monstrosity of his actions. He rationalized the continuous torture of the prince, arguing that without Orpheus's specific unique power, the absolute dominance of the Netherbrain would instantly consume them all. It was a terrifying philosophical absolute. Survival required the complete suppression of morality. For the Vanguard, and specifically for the fierce warrior Lae'zel, this revelation was an existential catastrophe. Lae'zel was forced to confront the agonizing reality that her entire worldview was a meticulously constructed lie. Her beloved, godlike Lich Queen Vlaakith had not only betrayed the founder of their race, but had kept the true, living heir chained in the dark for millennia. The Vanguard was forced into a sickening, temporary complicity. They needed the Emperor's shield to survive the coming battles, which meant they had to leave the prince to suffer in his infernal chains, carrying the crushing weight of his silent screams as they marched toward the shadow-cursed lands. Operating under the borrowed bloody protection of the prism, the Vanguard began the arduous, systematic dismantling of the cult's leadership. Their desperate campaign commenced at the weeping stone gates of Moonrise Towers. Here, beneath the heavy, unnatural fog of the shadow curse, they struck the first devastating blow against the Dead Three. By traversing the colorless, desolate dimension of the Shadowfell, the vanguard managed to locate and liberate the Aasimar Dame Island, severing the magical tether that granted Ketheric Thorm his absolute immortality. When the immortal general finally faced the vanguard upon the highest, rain-slicked battlements of his ruined fortress, he was no longer an invincible god of death. He was merely a broken, grieving man, entirely hollowed out by centuries of sorrow. As the vanguard's blades finally pierced his heavy armor, Ketheric Thorm crumbled into the cursed earth, his dark reign ending in a miserable, pathetic whisper, and the first of the 3 legendary Netherstones was secured from his rotting grasp. With the formidable army of Moonrise Towers shattered and the shadow curse slowly beginning to lift from the bruised land, the vanguard pressed onward, infiltrating the towering, labyrinthine streets of Baldur's Gate. The metropolis was drowning in a suffocating atmosphere of paranoia, its citizens terrified by the sudden, violent disappearances and the heavily armored patrols of the cult's enforcers. Deep beneath the city, within a subterranean temple of Baal that reeked of rotting meat and centuries of dried blood, the vanguard confronted the chaotic, terrifying madness of Orin the Red. The Chosen of Murder had transformed her sanctum into a theatrical slaughterhouse. The battle was a horrific, visceral nightmare, a clash of screaming blades and chaotic, unpredictable violence against a creature that could shift her flesh into any terrifying form. Yet Orin's fundamental instability proved to be her absolute undoing. The vanguard struck her down, silencing her manic laughter and tearing the second glowing netherstone from her bloody, mutated remains. The political collapse of the final Chosen was a masterpiece of strategic dismantlement. Enver Gortash, the smiling tyrant who had crowned himself Grand Duke of the city, believed himself entirely untouchable within his heavily fortified stronghold of Worm's Rock. He relied on his massive mechanical sentinels and his sweeping sociopathic political maneuvers to keep his enemies at bay. However, the vanguard systematically dismantled his alliances, exposed his terrible infernal dealings to the city's remaining nobility, and disabled his mechanical army from the shadows. When they finally cornered the Chosen of Bane in his grand, vaulted audience chamber, Gortash's arrogant smile finally broke. He fought with the desperate, tyrannical fury of a cornered warlord, but the combined overwhelming force of the vanguard shattered his defenses, claiming his life and the third, final Netherstone. The vanguard stood amidst the wreckage of the cult's leadership, clutching the 3 cold, heavily vibrating stones of Karsite magic. They had systematically dismantled the grand conspiracy. The Chosen of the Dead 3 were all dead, their bodies rotting in the dark, and their dark gods were once again starved of mortal devotion. The vanguard believed, with a desperate, exhausted hope, that they had finally won. They believed that by assembling the 3 Netherstones, they held the absolute, indisputable key to either subjugate or completely destroy the captive intelligence sleeping beneath the city. Guided by the Emperor, the vanguard descended deep into the winding ancient sewers of Baldur's Gate, pushing further down into the uncharted subterranean depths until the air grew incredibly hot and thick with the overwhelming scent of copper and brine. They emerged into a massive cavernous space known as the Morphic Pool. Before them lay a subterranean lake of thick, metallic fluid, and rising from the center of this dark water was the titanic, pulsating mass of the brain. It was a biological monument of staggering, terrifying proportions, its deeply ridged surface glowing with the sick, magenta light of the crown of Karsus, securely fastened around its circumference. The vanguard stepped forward to the very edge of the brine, their muscles tense, their hands trembling with exhaustion. They raised the three nether stones, intending to channel their combined world-altering magic to force the great beast into total submission. The stones flared with a blinding purple brilliance. The raw, heavy power of ancient Netheril washed over the cavern, striking the crown and the brain with the force of a magical hurricane. The vanguard braced themselves, waiting for the massive telepathic scream of absolute surrender. Instead, the damp, heavy air of the cavern was suddenly filled with the crushing, overwhelming weight of psychic laughter. It was a sound that completely bypassed their ears, echoing violently directly against the inside of their skulls, threatening to shatter their minds with its sheer, alien resonance. The magic of the netherstones did not bind the beast. It harmlessly dissipated against its heavily ridged flesh. The terrifying revelation at the morphic pool completely shattered the vanguard's understanding of the universe. The intelligence communicating with them was no longer a captive elder brain. It had evolved into something infinitely more dangerous, something that defied the very boundaries of arcane and psionic categorization. It was a nether brain. In a monologue of flawless, chilling telepathy, the nether brain revealed the true, horrifying depth of its grand design. It had never been truly dominated by the chosen of the Dead Three. From the very moment Ketheric, Gortash, and the Dark Urge had placed the crown of Karsus upon its mass, the ancient, supreme intellect had recognized an unprecedented cosmological opportunity. It understood that the unstable, world-breaking magic of Karsus could be absorbed, studied, and perfectly integrated into its own biological and psionic framework. It had orchestrated its own capture. It had willingly submitted to the humiliating, agonizing spikes of the Netherese magic, playing the role of the broken, subservient slave for months, simply to buy itself the necessary time to evolve beyond the limitations of normal illithid biology. The nether brain coldly explained that the vanguard's entire desperate, heroic journey had been nothing more than a meticulously calculated mathematical equation. The brain had deliberately leaked the location of the astral prism to ensure the vanguard would survive the initial infection. It had actively shielded them at crucial moments, gently guiding their path toward the city. The nether brain had utilized the vanguard as a highly effective, deeply motivated immune system. The mortal chosen of the Dead Three were incompetent, arrogant parasites, and the nether brain needed them entirely eliminated to secure absolute, uncontested control over the crown. The vanguard had done exactly what the nether brain had mathematically predicted they would do. They had slaughtered its masters and brought the three netherstones directly to its central pool, perfectly consolidating all the necessary magical components in one convenient location. The three netherstones were no longer keys to control the beast. They were entirely useless against an entity that had fundamentally rewritten its own existence, using the very magic the stones were designed to command. The nether brain had evolved entirely beyond the reach of Karsite magic. It was a new, synthetic god of pure, absolute psionic order. As the horrifying truth crashed down upon the paralyzed vanguard, the cavern began to violently shake. The Netherbrain no longer required the secrecy of the subterranean depths. It commanded the psychic stasis holding the millions of tadpoles across the continent to completely drop. In a matter of seconds, thousands of innocent citizens walking the streets of Baldur's Gate above them fell to the cobblestones in agonizing, violent convulsions, their flesh melting and their skulls cracking open as they underwent sudden, instantaneous seramorphosis. The stone ceiling of the morphic pool groaned and began to shatter. The Netherbrain, utilizing its newly ascended godlike power, simply rejected the heavy gravity of the earth. The titanic, pulsating mass rose from the briny water, tearing its way straight up through the bedrock, shattering the foundations of the city above. As the vanguard lay choking on the dust of the collapsing cavern, they felt the absolute freezing terror of total failure. The skies above Baldur's Gate tore open, vomiting massive organic nautiloid ships from the astral plane. The grand design had not been stopped. It had been perfected. The global invasion had officially begun, and the world of Toril stood entirely defenseless before the absolute, crushing silence of the new Illithid Empire. The vanguard had not been crushed beneath the collapsing stone of the morphic pool, for in the absolute fraction of a second before their total annihilation, they were violently pulled back into the shimmering, crystalline boundaries of the astral prism by the Emperor. They materialized upon the cold, floating islands of the pocket dimension, gasping for breath, their bodies battered and their spirits completely shattered by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the Netherbrain's grand deception. Through the translucent, jagged walls of their sanctuary, they could see the catastrophic reality unfolding outside. The skies above Baldur's Gate were completely black with sweeping armadas of illithid nautiloids, raining concentrated psionic fire upon the helpless, screaming city. The absolute end of all things had arrived, and the exhausted mortals were trapped within a fragile, floating prison. It was within this silent, timeless void that the Emperor presented the vanguard with a final, agonizing cosmological decision. The illithid pragmatist coldly explained the fatal flaw in their previous assault. The combined ancient power of the three Netherstones was indeed capable of commanding the heavily mutated magic of the crown of Karsus, but the mortal mind was biologically incapable of processing the unimaginably vast, complex psionic equations required to enact that command. A human, an elf, or a Githyanki could hold the stones, but they could not speak the mathematical language necessary to force the Netherbrain to obey. To save the world from total assimilation, the Emperor declared, they required a mind of equal, terrifying complexity. To wield the stones and end the crisis, someone must willingly embrace the absolute horror of seramorphosis. Someone had to become a mind flayer. This devastating revelation was immediately followed by a demand of profound, unforgivable cruelty. The Emperor stated that to ensure victory, he must consume the brain of the captive Prince Orpheus, absorbing the Githyanki royal's innate psionic disruption field to shield himself while he channeled the Netherstones. The vanguard was faced with an impossible, sickening moral calculus. To allow the Emperor to assimilate the Prince of the Comet was to guarantee the eternal enslavement of the entire Githyanki race under the tyrannical rule of the Lich Queen Vlaakith, trading the soul of an entire people for the survival of Toril. Yet to refuse the Emperor and liberate the prince was to invite the cold, calculating wrath of their only protector. When the vanguard ultimately chose the path of difficult righteousness and shattered the infernal chains binding Prince Orpheus, the emperor, driven entirely by his absolute, sociopathic instinct for self-preservation, immediately abandoned them. The entity that was once Baldurin simply drifted out of the prism and assimilated himself into the Netherbrain's collective, proving finally that no trace of his mortal humanity remained. Freed from his millennia of agonizing captivity, Prince Orpheus did not strike down his liberators, despite his deep, burning hatred for the illithid parasites residing within their skulls. The royal heir surveyed the apocalyptic crisis with the calm, tragic wisdom of a true leader. He recognized the undeniable truth of the emperor's cold mathematics. An illithid mind was the only instrument capable of dominating the Netherbrain. In the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, the Prince of the Comet, or a courageous, volunteering member of the Vanguard, was forced to undergo the very transformation they had fought so desperately to prevent. The chosen martyr surrendered their soul, their flesh shifting and mutating in a display of visceral, biological horror, their mouth tearing open to reveal the squelching tentacles of the enemy. They became a mind flayer, retaining just enough of their original consciousness to carry the heavy, vibrating netherstones into the final battle. The vanguard departed the astral prism and plunged directly into the apocalyptic chaos of the ruined metropolis. Baldur's Gate was a theater of absolute slaughter. Majestic red dragons clashed with biomechanical nautiloids in the burning skies, while the desperate citizens fought bloody, losing battles against hordes of newly transformed mind flayers in the streets below. The heroes fought their way upward, a bloody, exhausted march through the high hall until they reached the towering, pulsing biological stem of the Netherbrain itself. They climbed the shivering, fleshy spire, emerging upon the heavily ridged, magenta-glowing surface of the supreme entity. Here, amidst a tempest of raging psionic energy and falling ash, they engaged in the final, cataclysmic struggle against the brain's elite defenders and the tragic, mind-controlled remnants of the Emperor. At the zenith of the conflict, the newly transformed illithid martyr stepped forward, the three netherstones burning with blinding, violent power in their alien hands. They drove the ancient magic directly into the crown of Karsus. The metaphysical clash was deafening, a silent, telepathic scream that threatened to tear the fabric of reality apart. The martyr did not seek to usurp the brain and rule the absolute empire. Instead, utilizing the absolute limit of their fading mortal willpower, they commanded the Netherbrain to order the immediate destruction of every tadpole it controlled, and then to destroy itself. The supreme intellect, bound finally by the crushing weight of Karsite magic, had no choice but to obey. The Netherbrain plummeted from the sky in a blinding explosion of fire and necrotic ash, sinking into the boiling waters of the Chianthar River, taking the terrifying grand design down into the dark forever. The battle was won, but the profound, lingering trauma of the absolute crisis fundamentally altered the destinies of the surviving heroes. Gale Decarios, the wizard who carried the destructive orb within his chest, stood upon the docks and watched the crown of Karsus sink into the depths. He was faced with the ultimate test of his own catastrophic hubris, He had the opportunity to dredge the artifact from the water, to attempt to reforge the magic and ascend to godhood, risking a second Karsite folly that could shatter the weave once more. The true victory for the Wizard of Waterdeep lay in his ability to finally surrender his ambition, returning the incredibly dangerous artifact to the goddess Maestra, proving that he had finally learned the agonizing difference between wisdom and raw power. The noble Will Ravengard was forced to confront the permanent, heavy cost of his heroism. Having navigated the treacherous, binding stipulations of his infernal pact with the Cambion Mizora, he faced a final, binary choice. He could claim the political title of Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate, succeeding his father to rule the rebuilding city, or he could embrace his true calling as the Blade of Avernus. Choosing the latter, Will surrendered the comforts of the sunlit world entirely, plunging directly into the suffocating, sulphurous heat of the Nine Hells to hunt the fiends of the Blood War, ensuring that the devils who preyed upon the innocent would forever fear the righteous strike of his sword. This descent into the lower planes was inextricably linked to the tragic, agonizing fate of Karlach Cliffgate. With the Netherbrain destroyed, the temporary stabilization of her infernal engine ceased. The searing liquid fire in her veins reached critical mass. Upon the wooden planks of the harbor, she was forced to choose between two unimaginable horrors. She could remain in the world she loved and burn to ash, her vibrant soul shining painfully bright as it crossed into the cold, silent emptiness of the fugue plain. Alternatively, she could return to the burning, oppressive prison of Avernus alongside Will, surviving only by constantly fighting the demonic hordes of the abyss. There was no clean victory for the fierce barbarian, only a heartbreaking testament to the permanent physical scars of infernal manipulation. For Shadowheart, the cleric born as Genevieve Hallowleaf, the aftermath of the crisis demanded a final reckoning with the goddess of oblivion. Having previously rejected Shar's dark embrace to save the Aasimar Night Song, she returned to the cloister of somber embrace to confront Mother Superior Viconia Davier. Deep within the lightless halls of her childhood torture, Shadowheart found her parents, broken and chained in the dark. The Dark Goddess offered her a profoundly cruel ultimatum. She could sacrifice her parents to the shadows to permanently cure the agonizing, magical wound pulsing upon her hand, or she could save them, forcing her to bear Shar's crippling agony for the rest of her mortal life. In choosing love over her own comfort, Shadowheart reclaimed her true identity. She walked out of the cloister holding her parents' hands, proving absolutely that memory, even when violently fractured and heavily suppressed, forms the indestructible, radiant core of the mortal soul. In totality, the crisis of the Absolute serves as a profound historical testament to the cyclical nature of hubris. From Jergal's ancient abdication of the Bone Throne to the Dead Three's bloody overreach, and from Karsus's devastating arrogance to the Netherbrain's flawless calculating manipulation, the history of Toril demonstrates an inescapable cosmic truth. Both divine and mortal attempts to achieve absolute, unquestionable control inevitably birth the precise instruments of their own destruction. The exhausted, traumatized heroes of Baldur's Gate did not merely save a metropolis from falling tentacles and psionic fire. They corrected a massive cosmological imbalance that was centuries in the making, proving that the fragile, messy determination of a mortal heart can shatter the grandest designs of gods and monsters alike. But remember, the echoes of this crisis will shape the realms for centuries to come, and the cycle of mortal hubris and divine ambition is never truly broken. We shall explore the fallout of this new age in part 2. Until then, good night, traveler. Whatever horrors tomorrow may bring, rest now, for you have survived today. May the weave remain steady in your dreams, and may your road lead you away from the shadows.